Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. The rain had a way of hiding the world around them, turning everything into a blur of shadow and mist. Ethan and Noah trudged onward, their boots sinking into the wet earth with each step. Their gear, weighed down by the constant downpour, was soaked through, clinging to their skin like a second layer. The cold seeping into their bones did little to dampen their spirits, for they had been on many adventures before, though none quite like this. Colorado's Sangre de Cristo Mountains stretched endlessly in front of them, tall, foreboding, and ancient. The peaks loomed through the fog like silent sentinels watching them from afar. Despite the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance, the storm had begun to show signs of mercy, letting up just enough for them to continue their journey. The night sky, though shrouded in clouds, seemed to beckon them further into the wilderness, but something wasn't right. Something felt off. Noah glanced over at Ethan, his face cast in shadow. This storm, it doesn't feel like any normal storm, does it? Ethan didn't answer immediately. His brow furrowed as he glanced up at the towering cliffs above them. The wind carried a strange scent now, a mixture of wet earth and something else, something acrid, almost metallic. His compass, usually so reliable, spun wildly in his hand, the needle jittering as though caught in an invisible force. He'd noticed the same thing earlier, but he hadn't mentioned it. There were things in the mountains that didn't make sense, things that the ordinary world couldn't explain. He had read about them before, during his research on this region, but he'd never given them much thought. Not until now. Not normal at all, he replied finally, voice low. It feels heavier than usual, like something's watching. Noah nodded grimly, his gaze sweeping over the landscape. That's exactly what I thought. They had been trekking for hours, following the trail that wound up toward the ridge. But now, something new had caught their attention. A light, a T. First, it had seemed like nothing more than a flicker, just a brief flash from the corner of their eyes. But then it came again, higher up on the cliffside, just beyond the next bend. The light was dim and distant, but it was there, hovering, like a firefly in the vast emptiness of the storm. A soft glow, dancing in and out of view. Noah's eyes narrowed. Do you see that? Ethan's gaze locked onto the light. It pulsed like a heartbeat, flickering in and out of existence with a rhythm that felt offbeat, unnatural. It was too far to make out any details, but it was unmistakable. Something, or someone, was up there. He swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the cold air biting at his skin, the chill creeping into his chest. It could be a fire, maybe a campfire. Someone else is up here. The thought of other hikers, other people, was both a comfort and a discomfort. They were not alone in the wilderness, but there was something about the way the light appeared, always dancing out of reach, that gnawed at the edges of Ethan's mind. It wasn't the flicker of a typical fire, the way flames surged and swayed in the wind. This light didn't move like that. It seemed purposeful, intentional. I don't know, Noah said, his voice steady but laced with hesitation. It doesn't look like a fire. Too isolated. The wind picked up again, the howling gusts sending torrents of rain against their faces. Ethan pulled the collar of his jacket higher, his thoughts racing. The light was drawing them in, beckoning them towards something or someone. Let's check it out, Noah said, his tone almost eager, but it was the eagerness of someone trying to mask uncertainty. It was clear he, too, was feeling the pull, the strange urge to approach the unknown. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before nodding. All right, but we stick together. Keep an eye on the trail. This mountain's got a way of making you lose your bearings. They started up the incline, the mud slick beneath their feet, the air thick with the smell of wet moss and pine. Each step they took toward the light felt heavier than the last, as though the mountain was trying to make them turn back, to stop them from moving forward. But the light, it kept calling them, almost as if it were alive. They pushed on. With every step, the light seemed to grow faintly brighter, pulling them further into the unknown. The surrounding trees grew denser, their shadows stretching long and deep, their branches tangled like fingers reaching out to trap them. The sound of thunder rolled in from far away, and for a brief, disorienting moment, the mountains seemed to tremble. As they reached a clearing, the light finally came into full view. It wasn't a campfire after all. The glow was too controlled, too steady to be a fire. It hovered at the edge of the cliffside, high above them, casting an eerie glow against the blackness of the surrounding forest. It seemed to flicker on and off, but always in the same place, as if tethered to the mountain itself. Ethan and Noah exchanged a glance. "I don't like this," Ethan muttered, his voice barely a whisper. The air had grown unnaturally still, and the ground beneath their feet felt like it was holding its breath. "We should turn back," Noah suggested, his eyes scanning the darkened landscape. This is wrong." But just as they were about to step away, the light moved. It wasn't a sudden shift, but a gradual drift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to pull away from them, floating just out of reach. A soft hum, barely audible, vibrated in the air. The ground beneath their feet shifted subtly, as though something deep within the earth had stirred. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Did it just move?" Noah finished his sentence. "Yeah, it did." The light drifted further away from them, as if it had sensed their hesitation. It seemed to beckon them forward, tempting them to chase it. But as they stepped closer, it floated a little farther, staying just out of reach. "Maybe it's someone lost, like us," Noah suggested. Though his voice didn't carry the same certainty as before, Ethan was silent, his thoughts racing. "I don't think so. This feels different." They started toward it, their footsteps careful and deliberate. The world around them was entirely still, but the hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stood up, as if something was watching them. They kept their eyes on the light as it glided slowly across the ridge, always a step ahead, never quite giving them a chance to catch up. Noah checked his compass again. The needle spun wildly, dancing between points. The GPS on his phone had stopped working entirely. "Something's wrong," he muttered, his voice thick with unease. "I can't tell which way is which anymore." Before Ethan could respond, the light moved again, this time faster, further up the cliffside. "Do we keep following it?" Noah asked, a hint of panic creeping into his voice. Ethan didn't answer. His gaze locked onto the flickering light, his mind racing. Something deep inside him, some primal instinct told him to stop, to turn around and run. But the light was relentless, calling him, pulling him forward. "Let's just see where it goes," Ethan said, his voice flat. There was no turning back now. The light flickered once more and then disappeared into the shadows. The silence that followed was like a weight, pressing down on Ethan and Noah. The last flicker of the light had vanished, leaving only the oppressive blackness of the storm-shrouded night. It felt as though the mountain itself had swallowed the glow whole, leaving behind nothing but an unsettling emptiness. The sound of the storm returned in full force, its distant rumbles now growing closer, rolling through the peaks like a warning. Ethan paused, eyes darting nervously across the forest. "It's gone," he muttered, though the words didn't bring him any relief. The light had been so real, so close, and yet now it was simply gone. Just like that, it had vanished, leaving only the cold, damp wind in its place. Noah stood frozen for a moment, as if listening to something beyond the wind. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. "What do you think it was?" Ethan shook his head, trying to shake off the unease that clung to him like the damp air. "I don't know. Could have been someone up there. Someone with a lantern. Maybe a ranger station." "A ranger station this far up?" Noah's voice cracked with skepticism. "I've never heard of one this high on the ridge." Ethan didn't have an answer for that. He wished he could chalk it up to something logical, something mundane, but there was something about that light, something off about the way it danced. Just out of their reach. It wasn't just the flickering either. It was the way it moved, almost as if it were watching them, waiting for them to follow. Noah shifted uneasily on his feet. The wind was picking up again, whipping around them with force. He glanced at his compass once more. The needle spun erratically before coming to a slow, uncertain stop. "This is bad, man." "The compass." "I know," Ethan said, cutting him off. He had already noticed the same thing. "I don't know what's going on, but something's definitely off." The two of them stood in silence, the only sounds now the storm's roar and the hiss of water running over rocks in the nearby stream. Every now and then, the occasional flash of lightning illuminated the cliffs above them, casting jagged shadows across the landscape, but the light they had seen, it was gone. A shiver crawled up Ethan's spine. He wanted to turn back to follow the trail back to camp and leave whatever had been up on that cliff behind. But the sensation of being watched lingered, growing stronger with every passing second. There was a part of him that didn't want to let it go, didn't want to abandon the mystery, even though his gut told him to do just that. "We can't stay out here too long," Noah said finally, his voice strained. "This storm's getting worse. We need to find shelter." Ethan nodded in agreement. The rain had started to fall heavier now, turning the trail into a slick, slippery mess. They needed to find shelter, but every direction they turned seemed to lead them further into the wilderness, deeper into the unknown. The path they had been following now seemed unfamiliar, distorted. The mountain was twisting, reshaping itself, or so it felt. It was hard to tell which way was truly north anymore. The trees, the rocks, even the air. Everything felt off. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Ethan saw it again. The light. It flickered once more, this time much farther up the cliff, where the slope became steeper and more treacherous. It was faint at first, like a far-off star blinking in and out of existence. But the closer they got, the brighter it became. And once again it moved, further away from them, just out of reach, as if it were playing some cruel game. Noah saw it too. "It's moving again," he said softly, his voice tinged with disbelief. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "This isn't normal." Noah didn't need further explanation. His eyes were wide, and the nerves that had been creeping into his voice earlier were now unmistakable. "What do we do now?" The two men stood frozen for a moment, caught in the indecision of whether to continue or retreat. But the pull of the light was undeniable. It seemed to promise answers, or at least an end to the nagging uncertainty that clung to them both. Ethan, despite every instinct screaming to stop, found himself moving forward once more, his legs pushing him toward the cliff where the light danced. "Let's just see where it leads," Ethan said, his voice barely audible above the wind. He didn't know why he said it, but the words left his mouth before he could stop them. The mystery was pulling at him, gnawing at him in a way he couldn't ignore. Noah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he said, though his voice was thick with reluctance. "But we stick together." They moved as one, stepping carefully over the uneven ground, their eyes fixed on the flickering glow ahead. The closer they got, the more uneasy the atmosphere grew. The forest around them felt alive, as if the trees themselves were watching, their twisted branches reaching out to trap them. The ground beneath their boots seemed to shift with every step they took, as though the mountain was constantly changing beneath them, pulling them in different directions. As they approached the edge of the cliff, the light seemed to pause for a moment, hovering in place, almost as if waiting for them. The tension was palpable, thick as smoke, and every sense in Ethan's body screamed that they were stepping into something they couldn't comprehend. But they couldn't stop now. A flash of lightning illuminated the landscape, casting a brief but stark light over everything. And in that fleeting moment, Ethan saw it, standing at the very edge of the cliff, a figure, tall and indistinct, holding a lantern. The light from the lantern flickered with an unnatural stillness, casting a cold, ghostly glow across the surrounding rocks. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, as if it had always been there, waiting for them to come closer. Ethan froze. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Noah, wide-eyed, nodded slowly. "Yeah, I see it." The figure was watching them, the light from its lantern swaying gently, its face hidden beneath a dark hood. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. There was something about it, a presence, an energy that felt wrong, ancient even. The mountain seemed to press in on him, the air thick with a strange weight, as if the very earth was holding its breath. Another flash of lightning cracked the sky, illuminating the figure more clearly, and in that brief moment, it was gone, disappeared. Did it just vanish? Noah's voice was laced with terror. Ethan's hands were shaking as he stepped forward, his breath coming in short gasps. I don't know. But deep down, he did know. Something was out there, something that didn't belong to the natural world. Something that had been waiting for them. And it wasn't finished yet. The rain began to fall harder now, a torrential downpour that stung their faces like needles. But even the storm couldn't drown out the feeling of dread that now filled the air, thick and suffocating. Whatever had been on that cliff wasn't finished with them yet. The storm roared to life again, a crackling symphony of wind and thunder, sending waves of water cascading from the sky. The cold rain soaked through their jackets, chilling them to the bone, but it was the eerie silence that followed the disappearance of the figure that truly unsettled Ethan and Noah. The mountain felt like it was holding its breath, waiting, watching. Did we just see that? Noah's voice was barely audible over the storm's fury. His breath came in short bursts, his words hanging in the thick, wet air. Ethan couldn't find the words to answer. He didn't even know how to process what had happened. The figure, the lantern, the way it had vanished in an instant. It wasn't just an illusion. He knew it. "We need to keep moving," Ethan said, trying to force his voice to sound steady. He glanced around, his gaze scanning the mist and trees, but all he could see was the oppressive blackness of the storm. "We can't just keep going like this," Noah said, his voice tinged with fear. "That thing, it wasn't human. We're not supposed to be here." Ethan didn't disagree. Every instinct screamed that they should turn back, return to the safety of their camp, and leave whatever it was on the cliff behind. But there was something deeper, something that called him forward. He felt it in his bones, the pull of the mountain, the need to understand, the need to know what that figure had been and what it wanted. "You're right," Ethan said, "but we don't have much choice. We can't stay out here in the open. We'll freeze. Let's find shelter." They turned away from the cliffside, but the path seemed to warp in front of them. The trees loomed closer, their branches twisting in unnatural angles. The dense fog rose from the ground like a living thing, wrapping itself around their legs, making each step feel heavier than the last. The air grew colder, more suffocating. It was as though they were no longer in the same place, as though the mountain itself had shifted, bent the laws of the world. "I don't like this," Noah muttered, his voice strained. "I've been up here before, and this trail, it doesn't. Look right. We're not on the same path anymore." Ethan glanced back at the rocky ridge they'd come from. The cliffside, once so familiar, now appeared far off and indistinct, like a shadow of something real, its features lost in the thickening mist. It felt like they were caught in a dream, and the rules of the world no longer applied. They walked for what felt like hours, but it was impossible to tell how much time had passed. The storm raged on, blurring their vision, distorting their sense of direction. No matter how far they trekked, the mountains seemed to stretch endlessly in front of them. The trail they were following, if it could even be called a trail, was gradually fading, becoming less and less defined, until it was little more than a suggestion in the mud. "I don't know where we are anymore," Noah said, his voice shaking. "We should have turned back when we had the chance." Ethan didn't answer. His heart was racing in his chest, the pressure in his skull building, as if the very air was becoming denser, heavier. The sounds of the storm were muffled now, replaced by an eerie silence. It wasn't the usual quiet that followed a storm, where everything seems to exhale in relief. No, this was different. This was a silence that pressed against their ears, that wrapped itself around their thoughts, making everything seem distant, out of reach. The fog thickened, curling around them like fingers, and the further they went, the less they could see. Shadows danced at the edges of their vision, flickering in and out of existence like half-formed thoughts. Their footsteps seemed to echo too loudly in the silence, the sound stretching unnaturally. Noah stopped suddenly, his face pale beneath the rain. "Ethan, do you hear that?" Ethan paused, his heart hammering. For a moment, there was nothing but the storm. But then, beneath the roar of the wind, he heard it. A faint sound, so distant it was almost lost in the wind. It was a whisper, soft and insistent, like the rustling of leaves, but it didn't belong to the trees. "Noah," Ethan whispered. "Did you hear that?" Noah nodded slowly, his eyes wide, scanning the dense fog around them. "What the hell is that?" The whisper grew louder, and with it, a sense of deep dread. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. Something was speaking, but the words were indecipherable, like a language long forgotten, lost to time. It was coming from everywhere, the very air around them vibrating with the sound, filling their minds with an unsettling unease. Ethan's pulse quickened. "It's not the wind." Noah's face was etched with terror. "We need to get out of here, now." They turned, but the path they had followed was gone. The trees, once dense, their trunks solid and grounded, now loomed in strange angles. Their bark twisted into grotesque shapes, as if they were reaching for them. The trail, the ridge, everything was gone. The fog was too thick, the mountain had erased it all, and they were left standing at the edge of an infinite expanse of darkness. "What's happening?" Noah's voice was rising in panic. "Ethan, we've—" Before he could finish, a flash of light appeared once again, not far from where they stood. This time, it wasn't a soft, distant glow. It was bright, too bright. The same lantern light, now more tangible, more solid. But it wasn't a figure holding it. The light simply hung in midair, glowing with a sickly, unnatural brilliance. It didn't flicker like a normal flame. It pulsed, steady and mechanical, like it was alive. The air around them grew thick with the smell of decay, a metallic tang that stung their throats and made their eyes water. Ethan choked on the scent, trying to steady his breathing. The light grew larger, drawing them in with an almost magnetic pull, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. "No," Noah said, his voice breaking. "No, no, we need to get away from it. That thing, it's—" But before he could finish, the light pulsed once more, and suddenly, it was gone. And with its disappearance, the mountains seemed to shift. The ground beneath them trembled as if waking from a long slumber. The trees cracked and groaned as though they had been bent out of shape for too long, and the fog, now it seemed to thicken, coiling around their legs, rising higher, choking them. A figure stepped from the mist. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, but its outline was unmistakable. The same figure they had seen earlier, standing on the cliff, lantern in hand. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Ethan could feel its presence all around them, pressing in, suffocating. The figure didn't need to speak. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, stared into Ethan's soul, and for the briefest of moments, he saw himself reflected there. A deep, unspoken pain, the same torment that had been gnawing at him for days. He could feel it in his gut. The mountain was not just a place, it was a memory. And this figure, it wasn't just watching them, it was waiting. Noah stumbled backward, his legs giving way beneath him. "Ethan, we need to run, now!" Ethan barely heard him, his eyes locked onto the figure, and for the first time since arriving here, he understood. The figure was not some lost hiker. It wasn't an illusion. It was a guardian, a part of the mountain, and it had been waiting for them all along. The figure stood still, cloaked in shadow, its outline barely distinguishable against the thickening fog. For a long, heart-stopping moment, Ethan couldn't tear his gaze away from it. The air grew even heavier, charged with something ancient, something that felt far too old to understand. The whispers, which had faded when the light disappeared, now returned, this time in full force. They slithered through the fog like serpents, curling around Ethan's ears and pressing against his mind. Noah, his face pale with terror, took a step backward. "Ethan, I don't think we're supposed to be here," he whispered, his voice cracking. Ethan barely heard him. His thoughts were racing, but his feet felt frozen to the ground, as though the mountain itself had taken root in his bones. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but the air between them felt charged, as though it were waiting for something, or someone. And for the first time, Ethan had the terrifying sense that it wasn't waiting for them to run. It was waiting for them to make a choice. The lantern the figure held swayed gently in the non-existent wind, its flame flickering with an eerie stillness. The light from it was unnatural, too bright, too cold. It didn't feel like a flame at all. It felt like the very essence of the mountain, like it was not fire, but something older, something that had been burning long before the earth had ever been touched by human hands. The light seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched Ethan's heartbeat, slow and steady, as if it were alive, aware. Then, without warning, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, pulling at the branches of the trees and sending a shiver of cold through the air. The figure shifted, just slightly, an imperceptible movement, but enough to make Ethan's heart race faster. He took a shaky step forward, though his legs felt as if they weighed 1,000 pounds. "Do you see that?" Noah asked, his voice trembling with a mix of awe and fear. Ethan's eyes shifted, but he didn't have to look far. It was the face. In the flickering light of the lantern, Ethan could now see it. Or rather, what wasn't there. The figure's face was obscured by a shadow, but it wasn't an ordinary shadow. It was as if the darkness itself had gathered around the face, concealing its features in a way that was unnatural. Ethan's mind screamed for him to look away, to turn and run, but his body wouldn't obey. For a moment it felt like time itself had stopped. The world around him, the storm, the trees, even the whispers, ceased to exist. The only thing that remained was the figure and its empty, hollow gaze, staring into Ethan's very soul. There was no mercy in its eyes, no compassion, just an overwhelming sense of waiting, as though it had seen all of this before, as though it had seen them come and go countless times. "Who are you?" Ethan managed to rasp, his voice barely more than a whisper. his words stolen by the thick silence that had descended around them. The figure did not answer. It merely stood there, the lantern swaying, casting long shadows across the ground. And in that moment, Ethan felt a rush of fear like he'd never felt before. It was a suffocating, crushing wave that left him breathless, paralyzed in place. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more frantic, and he could hear them clearly now. Come closer. Come closer. The words were not spoken aloud, but somehow they reverberated through his entire body, as though they were seeping directly into his bones. The temptation to follow them, to step forward, was almost overwhelming. The mountain was calling him, just like it had called to the lost hikers decades ago, just like it had called to those who came before him. The pull was undeniable, like a hand reaching out from the depths of the earth, pulling him closer to the edge. "No, we need to get out of here," Noah said, his voice frantic now, his eyes wide and filled with terror. He grabbed Ethan's arm and yanked him back, but the weight of the mountain was too heavy. "Noah, stop," Ethan said, his voice cracking. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to Noah or to himself. The figure, the presence, felt like it was anchoring him to the spot, making it impossible to move. It was as though the very ground was holding him in place, preventing him from escaping. The wind howled again, whipping around them with unnatural force. Ethan could feel the temperature drop sharply, the air turning icy. The fog thickened, swirling around their feet like something alive, something hungry. And just as he thought he might lose his mind from the sheer pressure of it all, the figure spoke, not aloud, but in his mind. "Come closer and know the truth." The words echoed in Ethan's skull, an overwhelming sensation that threatened to consume him. His breath caught in his throat, and for a split second, the ground beneath his feet seemed to vanish. He staggered, clutching at Noah for support. But the figure's presence had enveloped them completely, and they were no longer on solid ground. The mountain had shifted, had pulled them into its grip. "No," Ethan whispered, shaking his head violently, trying to break free from the pull of whatever force had wrapped itself around him. "No, we're not going to follow it." But even as he spoke the words, he knew it was already too late. The mountain had claimed them, just as it had claimed the others before them. He could feel it in the air, the weight of centuries pressing in on him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and suddenly the ground seemed to shift once again, tilting beneath them. The very earth seemed to open, splitting apart, as though the mountain itself was about to swallow them whole. A flash of lightning illuminated the landscape, and in that brief, blinding moment, Ethan saw it again. The figure, standing at the very edge of the cliff, the lantern glowing brighter than ever, casting an otherworldly light across the jagged rocks. It was motionless, but Ethan felt it watching him, beckoning him forward with a force stronger than any he had ever experienced. "Noah." "I can't," Ethan gasped, his legs buckling beneath him. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to Noah or to the mountain itself. The world tilted, the whispers surged in intensity, and then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the figure vanished, disappearing into the mist as if it had never been there at all. The wind died down, and the storm seemed to retreat into the distance. The fog remained, thick and heavy, but the presence was gone. The silence was deafening. Ethan stumbled back, gasping for breath, his mind spinning. The mountain's weight lifted, and he could feel his legs trembling beneath him as he tried to steady himself. Noah, too, seemed dazed, his eyes wide, his face pale. "What just happened?" Noah asked, his voice low, shaken. "Where did it go?" Ethan didn't know how to answer. The world around them had shifted again, and the path they had been following was no longer there. The mountain, it seemed, had rearranged itself once more, creating a new reality, a new set of rules they would have to follow. But there was one thing Ethan knew for certain now. Whatever they had seen, whatever had been waiting for them on that cliff, was not finished with them yet. And the mountain? It wasn't going to let them leave. The stillness of the aftermath was suffocating. Ethan could feel his heart thundering in his chest, and for the first time since setting foot in the mountains, the reality of their situation struck him with full force. It wasn't just the storm, or the overwhelming sensation that the world had tilted beneath them. No, there was something darker at play here, something ancient and unfathomable that was playing with them. Noah, still shaking, took a tentative step back. His wide eyes scanned the fog that clung to the earth like a thick shroud, wrapping around the trunks of the gnarled trees that surrounded them. The wind had died down, but the air was heavier now, filled with an unnatural weight. The fog seemed to pulse, moving with a life of its own, undulating as if the mountain itself were breathing. Where did it go? Noah's voice cracked as he spoke, his words barely audible in the oppressive silence. He looked to Ethan, but there was a hollowness in his gaze now, something that hadn't been there before. That thing, that figure. Ethan swallowed, hard, trying to force the panic rising in his throat back down. He couldn't think straight. Everything was slipping through his fingers. Time, reality, the very essence of what they had been doing here. It was as though the mountain had erased it all, pulling them into a space where logic no longer applied. But deep down, Ethan knew they were still here. The figure wasn't gone. It was somewhere, watching, waiting. The mountain had set its course, and they were just pawns, caught in its game. "I don't know," Ethan said, his voice hollow. He cast a glance around them, trying to orient himself, but nothing seemed familiar anymore. The trail had vanished, the landscape distorted beyond recognition. The trees loomed overhead like ancient watchers, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. "But we can't stay here. We need to keep moving." Noah didn't argue. The fear was too raw in his expression, and neither of them was in any position to question what was happening. They had no choice but to follow the same path, even if it was one they couldn't see clearly, even if it led them further into the heart of whatever nightmare the mountain had in store. Ethan turned, trying to spot some semblance of a trail, something that would lead them out of this waking nightmare. But the path was gone. Instead, there was only fog, dense, heavy fog swirling around them in a rhythmic dance. It crept into their lungs, cold and damp, filling the air with the smell of earth and decay. For a brief, terrifying moment, Ethan thought he could smell something else, something sweeter, more metallic. Blood. He shook his head violently, trying to clear the thought from his mind. He couldn't think about it. Not now. The silence stretched, on thick and suffocating, pressing against his eardrums. And then, just when Ethan thought he might lose his sanity to the oppressive quiet, he heard it. A whisper. It wasn't loud at first, just a faint rustle in the air, like the soft sound of wind against dry leaves. He stopped in his tracks, his breath freezing in his chest. Noah froze as well, his eyes wide, scanning the fog for the source of the noise. "Did you hear that?" Ethan asked, his voice barely more than a breath. Noah nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I did." The whisper came again, louder this time, almost as if it were being carried on the wind, threading its way through the fog around them. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of something, someone, speaking just out of reach. "Help us." The words hung in the air like a half-formed memory, a voice that sounded ancient, heavy with sorrow. It wasn't a plea, but a command, a summons. Ethan's skin crawled and the fine hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "Who's there?" Noah called out, his voice a tremor, his words echoing in the vast emptiness of the mountainside. The fog seemed to respond, swirling in tighter, more chaotic patterns. The whisper came again, only this time it was clearer, more distinct, as if whatever was speaking was drawing closer. The words were now accompanied by something else, faint, indistinct sounds, like the scraping of nails against stone, a soft, dragging noise that seemed to come from the very depths of the mountain itself. Follow the light. Ethan felt a shiver crawl up his spine at the sound of those words. The voice had changed, had become sharper, more insistent. It was commanding them, urging them towards something, somewhere in the darkness. Noah's breath quickened, his eyes flicking nervously toward the trees. "That's not right," he muttered. "We're not supposed to..." The ground beneath their feet shifted suddenly, sending a wave of panic through Ethan's chest. It felt like the earth had moved, like the mountain had exhaled. And with it, the whole world had tilted. His balance faltered, and he reached out to steady himself, but the ground kept shifting, pulling them forward. Ethan tried to call out to Noah, but before the words left his lips, he saw it, the light. It flickered, distant at first, barely more than a small glimmer through the fog. But it was there, hovering in the distance, like a will-o'-the-wisp, dancing at the edge of his vision. Ethan's heart pounded harder in his chest, a sense of dread curling in his gut. The light was familiar, too familiar. He had seen it before, and this time, it wasn't just an illusion. This time it felt real. "Not again," Noah whispered, his voice shaking. "We can't..." "Don't follow it, Ethan. We're not supposed to..." But it was already too late. The light called to them, pulling them toward it with a force they couldn't resist. Their bodies, moving of their own accord, began to take steps toward the distant glow. The air around them grew colder, and the whispers, now clearer, began to rise again, rising in volume like a chorus. It was no longer just one voice. Now there were many. The whispers swirled in the fog, muttering unintelligible words, the language of the mountain, the language of lost souls. "Come closer. Come closer. You must know." Ethan felt the pull of the light grow stronger, stronger than anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just a glow anymore. It was a beacon, a calling. Something from deep within the mountain, something ancient. And the whispers had become clearer, more insistent, until they were all Ethan could hear. The light flickered once more, and Ethan felt his feet move faster, his body compelled toward it, as if he were nothing more than a marionette, the strings, pulled by the force of whatever was waiting for them. Noah tried to hold him back, but Ethan could see the fear in his friend's eyes, fear of what would happen if they didn't follow the light, fear of the consequences if they turned away. "Ethan, we can't," Noah gasped, his voice strained, with desperation. "If we follow it, we'll never get out. We'll be like the others." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "What others?" Noah's expression darkened, the words hanging heavy between them. "The hikers, the ones that disappeared. They followed the light too." The ground trembled again, harder this time. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, the pulse of the mountain in his chest. He looked back toward Noah, who was now stepping away, his face pale, his lips trembling. "I can't," Noah whispered, his voice a fragile thread in the suffocating silence. "I can't stay here. Not again." The light pulsed. One last time, a cold, beckoning glow, and Ethan followed. The light seemed to have a mind of its own, drawing them in with an almost magnetic pull, and Ethan couldn't resist its call. Each step felt both like a choice and a surrender. His legs moved on their own, carrying him toward the glow, and, though Noah hesitated at first, there was something in the air, something between them, that urged him to follow as well. The whispers had woven themselves into their bones, tugging at their thoughts, filling the spaces in their minds that the mountain had left vacant. The ground beneath their feet shifted again, uneven and treacherous, the soft earth giving way to jagged rocks as they neared the cliff. The light pulsed faster now, more erratic, like the beating of a heart, like the steady rhythm of something alive, something that wanted them to come closer. But with each step, the fog grew thicker, wrapping around them like a cloak of dread. The trees on either side of them bent in unnatural angles, their twisted limbs reaching toward the sky in grotesque shapes. The air had grown still, impossibly still, and the whispers were no longer just voices. They were feelings, impressions, memories that didn't belong to either of them but somehow resonated in their souls. Ethan's head was spinning. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. He couldn't think. Every rational thought he had seemed to dissolve into the mist, swept away by the insistent pull of the light. He didn't know what he was searching for anymore, only that he had to get closer, had to understand, had to... A sudden crack split the silence, sharp and violent. Ethan froze in his tracks, his blood running cold. The light flickered, and for a brief moment, everything around them seemed to shift, as if reality itself had been torn and re-stitched. "Noah!" Ethan cried out, turning toward his friend. But the words were lost as soon as they left his mouth. The fog had grown so thick that Noah's figure was barely visible just a few feet away. The landscape itself had warped, the trees and rocks shifting into strange forms, bending in on themselves. The world felt wrong, twisted in a way that defied logic. Ethan's breathing grew erratic, the air too thick to inhale properly. He reached out for Noah, but there was nothing. The forest stretched out in all directions like a labyrinth. The light pulsed again, stronger, brighter, just ahead, but the sense of displacement had become too much to bear. The fog wasn't just blocking their vision, it was distorting the very fabric of time. The path before them had vanished, swallowed by the mist, leaving nothing but a sheer drop at the edge of the cliff. How did we get here? Ethan wondered, though the question felt like a distant thought, disconnected from the reality unfolding around him. He looked down. The ground before them gave way to a steep descent, the rocky cliff face plunging into the void below. The light still flickered above, as though beckoning them to leap, to follow, to fall. "Ethan, we have to get out. This isn't right." Noah's voice, weak and frantic, snapped Ethan from his trance. Ethan looked at his friend, barely visible now through the thick veil of mist. The worry in Noah's voice was impossible to ignore. Was trembling, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "The light! We can't..." Ethan could see the terror in Noah's eyes now, the terror that mirrored his own. But it wasn't the light itself that frightened Noah. It was what the light was leading them toward. It wasn't just a beacon, it was a trap. "Noah, we have to go back." Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. He took a step backward, trying to step away from the cliff's edge, but his feet felt heavy. The pull of the light, the whispering voices, was too strong. It was like an invisible hand wrapped around his chest, tightening with every heartbeat. He turned to face Noah, but in the instant he did, the light vanished. The sudden darkness was so absolute, it was suffocating. The fog, now black as ink, rushed in, consuming everything. The ground beneath their feet shifted again, this time with a violent jerk. Ethan lost his balance and stumbled forward, crashing against Noah, sending them both tumbling toward the edge of the cliff. "No, get up," Noah shouted, scrambling to grab hold of Ethan, but it was too late. The world tilted. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs as they both tumbled down the cliffside, the ground slipping away beneath them. Their bodies hit the jagged rocks with a sickening thud, a sharp pain ricocheting through his chest. He gasped for air, his heart thundering in. His ears, they had fallen. The cold, wet ground scraped against his skin as he rolled to a stop. He lay there, gasping, dizzy from the fall, and for a moment, everything seemed still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. His mind was swimming, and it took him a moment to realize that he was no longer standing at the cliff's edge. He was at the bottom. Noah was beside him, groaning, clutching his arm as he struggled to sit up. Ethan's vision blurred, his head spinning. He was bleeding. There were cuts on his arms, his legs, and he could feel a dull ache in his ribs. He looked up and saw the cliffside, looming high above them. The path they had been on was gone, replaced by a sheer drop. How had they... Is this... real? Noah's voice was strained, his breath shaky. Where are we? Ethan didn't have an answer. He tried to push himself to his feet, but his legs felt like jelly. He glanced around at their surroundings. The world was eerily quiet now. The storm had stopped completely and the air felt colder, darker. They were surrounded by jagged rocks and twisted trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The only light now was the pale, sickly glow from the lantern above the cliff. But the light had no warmth. It didn't feel like a beacon. It felt like an anchor, pulling them deeper into the mountain's grasp. Ethan! Noah gasped again, his voice trembling with something deeper than fear. It was despair. What is this place? The realization hit Ethan like a blow to the chest. They hadn't fallen. They hadn't just lost their footing and dropped down the cliff. They had been pulled. Something had reached out for them, something that had known their every move, their every hesitation. The mountain wasn't just a place. It was alive, sentient, and it had been waiting for them to arrive. Waiting for them to fall into its embrace. The whispers were louder now, clearer, but now there was something more. The voices weren't alone. There was something else in the air, something palpable, something that had been watching them from the moment they had entered this cursed place. And now the mountain had claimed them. The darkness that surrounded them was thick, oppressive, and unnaturally quiet. The mountain's once vibrant, alive atmosphere now felt hollow, as if the world had drawn a deep, shuddering breath and held it, suspended in time. Ethan's head swam with the after effects of the fall, the pain from his scraped body and bruised limbs almost drowned out by the eerie silence. But as much as he wanted to ignore the feeling gnawing at the back of his mind, he couldn't escape the awareness that they were no longer in control. They weren't merely lost, they were trapped. Noah, still breathing heavily beside him, stumbled to his feet and looked around, his eyes wide with an unsettling combination of fear and disbelief. "Where the hell are we?" he muttered, almost to himself. His voice trembled, and despite his obvious terror, Ethan could see the glint of something more in his friend's eyes. The dawning realization that they had ventured too far into something far darker than they could have imagined. Ethan didn't know the answer, but he felt the weight of it. This place, this strange, desolate valley they had fallen into, was not of the natural world. It felt wrong. The very air was thick with a sense of history, an old, heavy presence that pressed against their lungs, suffocating. The fog, though no longer the same roiling mist from before, had settled into an eerie, stagnant pool that clung to the ground. It didn't dissipate, but seemed to wrap around the rocks like an endless shroud, curling in on itself. "I don't know," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. He wiped his blood-slicked hands on his jacket and forced himself to look around. The rock faces surrounding them were jagged, craggy, and coated with ancient moss that seemed to pulse with dark energy. He could barely make out any distinguishing features in the gloom. It was as though they had fallen into the belly of the mountain itself, where the light from the lantern above couldn't reach. They had to move. They couldn't just lie there, trapped in this strange place, but the thought of standing up and walking deeper into whatever waited for them was terrifying. "Let's get out of here," Noah said finally, his voice shaking but determined. "We've got to find a way back to the ridge, find some sign of the trail." His eyes scanned the rocky walls surrounding them. "There's got to be a way out." Ethan nodded in agreement, his stomach twisted in knots. They had to keep moving, but every step felt more and more uncertain. The very ground beneath them felt wrong, too soft in places, too hard in others. They had no real sense of direction, and the overwhelming sense that the mountain was shifting, moving around them, was becoming almost unbearable. Every time they thought they saw a path or a break in the terrain, it turned out to be an illusion. Another trick of the mind. As they moved, the darkness seemed to close in tighter. The heavy silence pressed against their ears, louder than the storm had ever been, until even their footsteps seemed muted and swallowed by the oppressive air. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Ethan saw it. A small break in the fog, a shift in the wall of rock that had surrounded them. "Wait," he said, stopping suddenly. Noah stumbled into him, his shoulder crashing against Ethan's as he tried to steady himself. "What? What is it? I think." Ethan trailed off, his voice faltering as he stepped toward the break in the rock. "There's something there." Noah followed him reluctantly, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "I don't know, man. This place, I don't think we should..." But it was too late. Ethan had already moved toward the opening. It wasn't much. A small crack between two jagged boulders, barely wide enough for them to slip through. It was the kind of thing that, in any other circumstance, they might have passed by without a second thought. But in this place, in this twisting, ever-shifting world, it felt like it was calling them, beckoning them towards something. Ethan crawled through, the narrow space forcing him to bend low, his breath catching in his throat. The fog seemed to follow them, curling between the rocks. But as they pushed forward, the air began to shift. It wasn't the suffocating weight of the fog anymore, but something lighter, something with a strange metallic scent, like old iron and the faintest trace of earth. The feeling that something ancient had once walked here, something long forgotten, pressed in on him. On the other side, they emerged into a small, dimly lit cavern. It was cooler here, and the air smelled faintly of moss and stone. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols etched into the rock, their lines curved and sweeping in, ways that made Ethan's skin crawl. The faint glow of something dim, pale and almost ghostly, lit the cavern's far corners. He could barely make out a series of objects piled together, a collection of relics so strange, so out of place, that he almost didn't want to get any closer. "What is this?" Noah whispered, stepping forward, his voice carrying a note of awe. "What is all this?" Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he surveyed the scene before them. At first it seemed like a pile of discarded materials, rusted lanterns, old ropes, tattered packs, even a few broken-down tents, but something in the shadows caught his attention. There, beneath the debris, was something else. A wooden box, old and worn, sitting half-buried beneath the rubble. Its surface was cracked, but its edges were still sharp, untouched by time. A faint, flickering light seemed to radiate from it, almost imperceptible in the gloom. Noah stepped forward, his hand reaching for the box, but Ethan grabbed his wrist before he could touch it. "Noah," Ethan whispered urgently, his voice tight, with a sudden sense of dread. "Don't." But Noah had already pulled free, ignoring Ethan's warning. His fingers brushed against the wood of the box, and for a brief moment, the air seemed to hold its breath. As soon as Noah's hand made contact with the surface, a low, eerie hum filled the cavern. The light from the box flickered brighter for a brief moment, casting twisted shadows across the walls. The symbols on the stone began to glow faintly, and the ground trembled under their feet, as if the mountain itself was awakening. The whispers, which had been a low murmur before, suddenly grew louder, more distinct and more frantic. "Come closer," they whispered. "Take what is yours." "Noah, stop," Ethan shouted, grabbing his friend's arm and pulling him back, but it was too late. The box had already started to open, the lid creaking slowly, groaning under an unseen weight. And then, with a final, painful crack, the box broke open, and what lay inside was not an artifact. It was not a treasure. It was a heart, pale and lifeless, but glowing with a sickly faint light. And around it, wrapped in ancient cloth, was a tattered newspaper clipping. Ethan's blood ran cold as he read the headline: "Two hikers lost, following the lights on the cliffside, 1984. The cavern was suddenly suffocating, the air thick with a cold, almost tangible presence. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the tattered newspaper clipping that Noah had unwittingly uncovered from the wooden box. The pale light from the glowing heart cast long shadows across the walls, making the symbols etched into the rock seem to twist and shift in the dimness. The whispers had returned, louder now, like a chorus of voices that carried centuries of sorrow, beckoning him to understand the past, to see the truth. Noah, still holding the fragile paper in his hands, stared at it blankly for a moment before his fingers trembled, and he unfolded it. The sound of the creased paper loud in the heavy silence. As he read, his face grew pale, his lips trembling as though the words on the page were poisoning his mind. "Look at this," Noah whispered, his voice shaking, though his eyes were locked onto the text. Ethan moved closer, his own stomach tightening, with dread as he peered over Noah's shoulder to read the headline, "Two hikers lost, following the lights on the cliffside, 1984. Ethan's heart seemed to drop to his stomach, the reality of what they were looking at sinking in slowly, as though the very meaning of it was trying to claw its way into his brain. The paper was old, yellowed with time, but the words were still legible, the ink faded, but intact. "That's..." Ethan's voice faltered. "That's what happened. The story. We heard about it. The rescue attempt." Noah turned the page slightly, his eyes scanning the text, but his voice caught in his throat. "It says here that the two hikers, Gregory and Emma, had been following the same lights we saw. They'd been drawn in by the flickering on the cliffs. It's the same thing." His voice trembled with disbelief. They followed it just like us. And then they..." A new section of the article caught Ethan's eye, its words growing clearer as he leaned in closer. His breath caught as he read aloud the next line, his voice growing cold. "Disappeared without a trace, leaving only their packs, gear, and a trail of strange markings in the dirt. The search was abandoned after 6 weeks. It is believed that the two hikers were lost to the mountain itself and that no one who follows the lights has ever returned." A chill washed over Ethan, spreading from the pit of his stomach, crawling up his spine. The familiar pull, the sense that something ancient and cruel was at play, was growing heavier in his chest. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This had happened before, and it was happening again. They never found their bodies," Noah whispered. His voice broke, his hands trembling as he clenched the paper tighter. "It says here that their bodies were never found. Only these strange markings were left behind." Ethan's gaze flickered to the edges of the cavern, to the walls lined with symbols. His stomach twisted with unease. The markings, these strange arcane symbols, had been etched into the stone. They weren't random. They seemed to follow a pattern, a language that made his head throb with discomfort. But as his mind reeled from the implications of the discovery, his eyes shifted downward toward the glowing heart in the box. The heart was still pulsing faintly, like it had a rhythm of its own. A soft, unnatural glow emanated from it, and Ethan couldn't help but feel that it was alive. The light from it illuminated the cavern walls with an eerie glow, making the symbols dance, their lines shifting in ways that made him feel as though the very rock was breathing. "That," Ethan murmured almost to himself. "That wasn't just an artifact. It's alive somehow." Noah, too, had turned his attention back to the strange heart. His face was drawn tight with fear, but his curiosity seemed to overwhelm his hesitation. He reached out toward the glowing object, but Ethan grabbed his wrist just in time, pulling him back. "No, Noah, don't touch it," Ethan hissed, his voice hoarse with warning. Noah looked at him, startled, but the look of desperation in his eyes was unmistakable. "We need to understand it. We need to figure out what's going on." His voice was hoarse, almost pleading, as if the heart itself was calling him to it, urging him forward. Ethan shook his head, but his grip on Noah's wrist was firm. He could feel the weight of it, the danger that was building with every second they lingered here. The truth that they were uncovering was as dangerous as the mountain itself, and, deep down, he knew they couldn't afford to go any further. They were already too far in. "Listen to me," Ethan said, his voice low and intense. This thing, it's not just a memory, Noah. It's feeding on us, on our curiosity. That light, it's not leading us to something. It's trapping us here, just like it trapped them." His throat tightened as he tried to keep his voice steady. "This is their fate, the people who came before us. They followed the lights, and now they're part of the mountain, part of whatever this is." Noah's face turned pale, his eyes flickering, between the glowing heart and Ethan. The realization of what Ethan was saying seemed to finally hit him, and for a moment, Noah was speechless. They weren't rescued. They weren't lost, Noah whispered, almost as if to himself. They were claimed. Ethan's heart raced as he nodded. He had no doubt. The hikers from decades ago hadn't simply vanished. They had become part of the mountain, like countless others who had ventured too close, too deep into its grasp. The mountain wasn't just a place of danger, it was a place of consumption. And the lights, the lure of the light, was a trap, a call from something that lived deep within the earth, something hungry, something ancient. It had been waiting for them. The silence in the cavern grew heavy again, but this time it wasn't just the quiet of their surroundings, it was the silence of understanding, the quiet terror that wrapped itself around them both, tightening, like a noose. "Why did they leave this here?" Noah asked, his voice trembling. He was still staring at the glowing heart, the mystery of it all gnawing at him. Why was it left behind? Was it meant for us to find? Ethan didn't have an answer. He didn't know. But he had a terrible feeling that whatever had been left behind had been waiting for someone to uncover it. It wasn't just about the hikers. It wasn't about curiosity anymore. The mountain was alive and it was watching them. It had always been watching, and it had been waiting for the right moment to take them too. Before Ethan could speak again, the cavern shifted. The ground trembled beneath their feet once more, the walls of the cave groaning, the air thickening, with a heavy pressure. The whispers were louder now, more frantic, like the voices of the lost hikers, pleading for them to understand, for them to join them in the mountain's eternal grip. The ground cracked open at their feet. Noah gasped. "Ethan!" Before he could finish, something deep inside the mountain began to stir. Something ancient, something hungry. The heart began to glow brighter, faster, the pulse of it synchronizing with the beat of Ethan's own heart. And somewhere, in the distance, a figure emerged from the mist, the same shadowed form they had seen before, carrying a lantern, waiting for them. The mountain had claimed them. The ground shook again, this time with such intensity that the walls of the cavern seemed to groan, cracking and splitting like ancient bones. Ethan's breath caught in his chest as the ground beneath their feet buckled, sending a spray of stone and dirt into the air. The cavern was no longer a safe place. It had become something alive, something that had awakened. A low, rumbling sound filled the air. Not thunder, but the sound of the mountain itself shifting, stirring, groaning with ancient hunger. Ethan grabbed Noah's arm and yanked him away from the heart, pulling him toward the nearest wall of the cavern for some semblance of stability. The tremors rattled through their bodies, every muscle straining against the shaking, every step feeling like a fight against the very mountain that was now consuming the air around them. "Noah, we need to get out," Ethan shouted, his voice strained, but it was barely audible over the growing cacophony of the mountain's fury. The symbols on the cavern walls were flashing, pulsing in time with the growing tremors, their dark, jagged lines bending and twisting as though alive. The fog seemed to swirl tighter, constricting, drawing inward like a funnel closing in on them, but Noah wasn't listening. His eyes were wide with terror, fixed on the glowing heart, which pulsed in the box, its faint light now blinding too, intense to ignore. The whispers, no longer soft, no longer far off, ripped through the air like a scream. "Come closer. Come closer. It is time. Noah, we don't have time for this." Ethan yelled, shaking him harder. He was panicking now, his chest tight with fear. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't let the mountain claim them too. The tremors were growing stronger, and the very ground beneath them felt unstable, as though it could swallow them whole at any moment. The whispers were becoming more frantic, more insistent, and with each passing second, the pressure of the mountain's presence weighed more heavily on Ethan's mind. Noah, his face drained of color, blinked rapidly, as if he were waking from a trance. I can't think straight," he muttered, stumbling back, his eyes unfocused. "This place, it's messing with my head. It's like it's pulling me toward it." Ethan didn't wait for another second. He grabbed Noah by the shoulders and turned him toward the cavern's narrow passage, the one they had come through. "We need to go, now," Ethan commanded, his voice shaking with urgency. He had no idea how much time they had left before the mountain's rage consumed them both. But before they could move, the temperature in the cavern dropped. It wasn't just a chill. It was a deep, suffocating cold that seemed to seep into their bones, freezing the very air around them. Ethan's breath became visible in the air, the icy fog swirling around them like the mountain itself was exhaling death. His hands shook violently, and for a moment he couldn't feel his fingers at all. It was like the mountain was claiming every ounce of warmth in their bodies, as if it had become the source of all cold. "Noah," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "Do you feel that?" Noah, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear, nodded but didn't answer. He was trembling violently now, his teeth chattering in the unbearable cold. The whispers grew louder. The voices were no longer distant or ambiguous. They were clear, now distinct, full of urgency, as if the very souls of the lost hikers were trapped inside the mountain's depths, clawing at them, begging for release. "Come closer. Take what is yours. You are the next." "No!" Ethan shouted, his voice rising above the cries of the mountain. "We aren't like them. We won't follow you." But even as he spoke, the mountain seemed to press in on him. The walls of the cavern closed in, and the ground shifted again, tilting beneath their feet. Ethan could feel something cold, colder than the air, brushing against his skin. It wasn't just the temperature. It was a presence, a touch that felt like a frozen hand grazing his face. Suddenly, a figure appeared before them, emerging from the thick, swirling mist. Ethan froze, the world around him growing silent for the briefest of moments. The figure was tall and cloaked in shadow, its face hidden beneath a hood of darkness. The lantern it carried flickered with the same cold, unnatural light, casting long, distorted shadows across the cavern's walls. The figure stood motionless, its presence so overpowering that Ethan could feel it pressing against his chest, suffocating him. It was the same figure they had seen on the cliffside. The air around them grew heavier, the temperature plummeting, further until it felt like the very life had been drained from their surroundings. Ethan's vision blurred as the coldness crept into his bones, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. The figure's lantern glowed brighter, the light sickly and unnatural, casting strange, elongated shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Who are you?" Ethan gasped, his voice strained, hoarse with fear. The figure did not answer. It simply stood there unmoving, as if it had always been a part of the mountain itself. The light from its lantern flickered again, and for a brief moment Ethan thought he saw something in the figure's hand. Something dark and familiar, like a faded piece of fabric. A torn piece of clothing, blood-stained and ragged, fluttered in the cold breeze. Then the figure raised its other hand, pointing toward them. The movement was slow, deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. And as it did, Ethan felt the unmistakable weight of its gaze. Though he couldn't see its eyes, he could feel them. The weight of something watching him, observing him, judging him. His chest tightened as if something had wrapped around his heart and was slowly squeezing the life out of him. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, urging him, "Take it. Take what is yours." "No," Noah whispered, his voice cracking. He was backing away now, his face a mask of terror, his body shaking violently. "This isn't real. This isn't happening. We're not going to be like them. We're not." But the figure stepped forward, its movements fluid and unnatural. Ethan could feel his legs trembling, his body urging him to run, to escape. But the pull of the mountain, the cold grip of the figure, was too strong. It was as if they were rooted to the spot, held in place by something far older and far more powerful than their fear. "Come closer," the voice whispered again, this time in their minds, not their ears. "You are the next. You will follow." The figure extended its hand, holding the lantern toward them. And in that moment, Ethan realized what it wanted. The lantern was not a source of light. It was a key, and it was calling them to follow. Ethan tried to move, to shout, to scream, but his body wouldn't obey. His mind was clouded, his vision swimming. The cold was overwhelming now, and he could feel it deep within him, the sense that he was being consumed, slowly, surely, by the mountain's eternal hunger. He reached for Noah, but Noah was already collapsing to his knees, his face pale, his breath shallow. The mountain had already claimed him. He was falling to the same fate as the lost hikers before them. And then, as Ethan reached out for his friend, the figure was upon them. It was the last thing Ethan saw before everything went dark. Ethan's world faded into darkness, the cold creeping deeper into his bones until there was nothing left but the sensation of weightless, endless blackness. He tried to scream, but the sound never left his mouth. His body felt heavy, like it was sinking into the very earth itself. And yet he couldn't move. The cold, suffocating grip of the mountain had wrapped itself around him, binding him in place, keeping him locked in the dark where the whispers could reach him. He could hear them now, clearer than ever before. They were no longer distant, faint murmurs. The voices had become sharp, distinct, and full of anguish. They echoed in his mind, filling the empty void around him like a chorus of the lost. "Come closer. Come closer. We are the ones who were lost. You will join us." Ethan tried to fight against the pull of the voices, tried to break free from the oppressive darkness, but it was useless. The mountain was inside him now, and it was drawing him deeper into its grasp. A sudden flash of light pierced the darkness, cold and unnatural, like the flicker of the lantern the figure had carried. It was distant at first, then closer until it surrounded him completely. His eyes snapped open, but what he saw wasn't the cavern, nor the misty landscape of the mountain. Instead, he found himself standing at the edge of the cliff, just as he had seen before. But this time, there was no storm. The air was still, and the light from the lantern hovered in the distance, beckoning him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, wrapping around him like a shroud. "Follow it." He turned to look at Noah, but his friend was no longer beside him. Instead, there was a figure standing in the mist, a silhouette outlined by the dim, flickering light. It was familiar, but something was wrong. The figure seemed too still, too silent. Ethan could feel the weight of its gaze, and though he couldn't see its face, he knew it was watching him, waiting. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the figure stepped forward, slow and deliberate. It wasn't human, or at least it didn't feel human. It was something else, something that belonged to the mountain. The darkness, the cold, the whispers, they were all a part of it. The figure raised its hand, and the lantern's light flickered brighter, casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally along the ground. "Ethan." The voice was soft, like a breath on the wind, but it carried with it a weight of sorrow and dread. "You're too late." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar. It was Noah's. "Don't listen to it," Noah's voice pleaded, from the darkness. "Don't follow it, Ethan. You have to fight." But before Ethan could respond, the figure raised the lantern higher, and the light blazed with such intensity that it momentarily blinded him. He tried to shield his eyes, but the light pushed deeper into his soul, pulling at something inside him, something old and forgotten. It felt as though the light was consuming him, erasing his identity, his very essence, until he was nothing more than a vessel for the mountain's will. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the overwhelming light. Suddenly, the world shifted. Again. The mountain's grip on him released, and Ethan collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The light dimmed, and he found himself back in the cavern, disoriented and shaking. The whispers were still there, but now they were faint, like the dying echoes of a memory he couldn't quite grasp. He blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The cavern was silent now. The cold that had gripped him was gone, and the shadows around him no longer felt threatening. But something had changed. Something inside him was different. The mountain had shown him something, a truth that he wasn't sure he could fully understand yet. The lantern, the figure, the voices, it was all tied together, linked to the heart they had uncovered, to the mystery that had been waiting for them. But Noah? Where was Noah? Ethan scrambled to his feet, panic rising in his chest. He had to find Noah. He couldn't leave his friend behind in whatever nightmare the mountain had trapped them in. The echoes of Noah's voice still rang in his mind, and the realization hit him like a wave. Noah had been here before, just like those other hikers. He had followed the light, and now he was part of it. The ground beneath Ethan's feet trembled again, but this time it wasn't violent. It was more subtle, like the mountain was breathing. The walls around him seemed to shift slightly, their shapes blurring in and out, as though they were caught between worlds. The cavern seemed to stretch, to grow, and for the first time, Ethan realized something truly terrifying. This place wasn't just a part of the mountain. It was alive. It had its own will, its own desires. And now, it was reaching out for him. Ethan turned, his breath shallow, and searched desperately for an exit. But the path they had entered through had disappeared. The narrow passage was gone, swallowed by the mountain's shifting walls. The cavern was now a labyrinth, the shadows twisting and contorting, shifting like they had a life of their own. Follow the light. The whisper was faint, but it was unmistakable. The mountain was calling him again, beckoning him to return to the cliffside. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had to make a choice. The mountain was offering him an escape, a way out, but only if he followed it. He thought of Noah. His friend had been here before. He had been lost to the mountain, and Ethan couldn't let that happen again. He turned back toward the heart, still glowing faintly in the box, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. The newspaper clipping was still pressed in the debris, its edges worn and yellowed with age. Ethan's hand hovered over it, but the mountain's whispers grew louder, drowning out everything else. The past is a shadow. The light is your future. Come closer. He knew he couldn't stay here. Not anymore. The mountain's grip had already claimed too much. But to leave, to run, meant abandoning Noah, leaving him to become another part of this twisted landscape. And what if he was next? What if there was no way out? What if there was no escape from the pull of the mountain? For a moment he hesitated, and then he understood. The mountain was his escape. But it wasn't the path he thought it was. It had been waiting for him, calling to him for reasons beyond his understanding. The heart, the lantern, the figure on the cliff, they were all part of the same force. With a final, terrifying realization, Ethan understood that he wasn't going to escape the mountain, not unless he faced the truth. The mountain wasn't just trapping them, it was feeding on them, and soon it would claim him too. Ethan stood still in the cavern, the weight of the mountain's pull pressing down on him. The heart in the box, glowing faintly with its unnatural light, seemed to pulse with every beat of his own heart. The cavern around him was alive with sounds, soft whispers, distant murmurs, and the almost imperceptible thrum of the mountain's endless heartbeat. But beneath the noise, something else stirred, something darker. It wasn't just the mountain anymore. It was him too. The truth that had been hanging over them all along had finally settled within him like an unshakable weight. He could feel it in his gut. The mountain was waiting for him to act. Noah's voice still echoed in his mind, desperate and pleading. "Don't follow it, Ethan. Don't let it take you too." The words were fading, but they felt like a warning. He could still hear the terror in Noah's voice, the fear that came from knowing exactly what this place was capable of. And it terrified Ethan to realize that Noah had already fallen victim to it. He had followed the light. He had given in to the mountain's will, and now there was no turning back. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry, his thoughts spiraling. He had to find Noah. He had to save him, if it was even possible. But the whispers, those insistent, urgent calls, seemed to know exactly where his mind was. "Come closer, come closer." The voice was louder now, not in his ears, but inside his skull, as if the mountain itself was speaking to him, pushing him toward the edge. He could feel it drawing him forward, pulling him closer to the unseen center of this labyrinthine cave. And then he heard it, the voice. It was faint at first, so quiet that he thought it might be his own mind playing tricks on him. But it came again, clearer this time, cutting through the endless whispers like a blade. "Ethan." The voice was soft, desperate, as if calling him from far away. It was not the voice of the mountain, but someone else's. Ethan froze, his heart skipping a beat. He had heard that voice before. It was Noah's. "Noah?" Ethan called out, his voice cracking, though he wasn't sure if he truly expected a response. The silence that followed was oppressive. But then, that same voice came again, stronger now, filling the cavern with a strange sense of urgency. "Ethan, please." The voice was distant, but closer now. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a cry, full of pain and fear, echoing around the walls of the cavern. "Please, don't let it take me." Ethan felt his heart race. He could hear it now, could almost feel Noah's presence, though his friend's body was nowhere to be seen. He was still trapped in the mountain, his essence lost in the labyrinth of twisted rocks and dark passages. But somehow, through the fog, through the whispers, Ethan knew that Noah was close. The light, the lantern, the figure, had been leading them towards something, and he understood now that it wasn't a place. It was a point where all the lost souls of the mountain converged, where the mountain's hunger was at its strongest. Without thinking, Ethan's legs began to move. He had no idea where the figure had gone, but he knew one thing for certain. He could feel Noah's presence pulling him toward it. He had to find him. He had to stop the mountain from taking any more. But the deeper Ethan moved into the labyrinth, the stranger the landscape became. The walls of the cavern seemed to close in on him, narrowing until he could barely move. The air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and something sharper, more acrid. The ground beneath his feet was slick with moisture, and the whispers grew louder, closer, pressing in on him, clawing at his mind. The mountain's voice was insistent now. Come closer. It is time. He stumbled forward, driven by the urgency in Noah's voice. But the deeper he went, the more distorted the world around him became. The walls of the cavern seemed to shift, as if the very rock itself was alive, twisting and contorting to keep him from reaching his goal. The lantern's light flickered in the distance, almost teasingly, always just out of reach. Every time he thought he was getting closer, the light would move further, as if it were playing some cruel game. "Noah!" Ethan shouted again, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Where are you?" There was no answer, but the faint glow of the lantern was enough to guide him forward. He kept moving, his pulse racing, his breath ragged, as though the mountain itself were forcing him to hurry, to get closer to whatever lay ahead. But the deeper he went, the more something seemed to change in the air. The silence had shifted again, but this time it wasn't just oppressive. It was suffocating. The light from the lantern grew brighter, too bright to look at directly, and with it came the cold, a biting cold that seemed to freeze his very bones until he could no longer feel his hands or feet. And then he saw it. The figure. It stood at the end of the narrow tunnel, bathed in the cold light of the lantern. Its cloak swirled around it like smoke, its face still hidden beneath the shadow of its hood. The figure raised its hand, and once again the lantern pulsed with that unnatural light, casting long, dark shadows against the walls. The temperature dropped even further, until Ethan could see his breath fogging in front of him. But something was different about this figure. This time, it wasn't silent. This time, it spoke. The voice was low, haunting, and full of an ancient sorrow. Ethan. The voice wasn't just the figure's. It was Noah's, twisted and warped, as though the mountain had taken his friend's soul and bound it to the very rock itself. "You've come. Too late." Ethan's heart dropped into his stomach, and he stumbled backward, his hands trembling at his sides. "Noah?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "What happened to you? What have they done to you?" The figure tilted its head slightly, and for the first time, the faintest glimmer of its face was revealed beneath the shadow. But it wasn't Noah's face that stared back at him. It was the same shadowed mask that had haunted him since the cliffside. The figure was the mountain, its hunger embodied in this form, using Noah's voice to lure him closer. "No," Ethan whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. He stepped back, his feet slipping against the slick floor of the cavern, but the figure was already moving toward him, the lantern flickering brighter with each step. "No, you're not Noah. You're it. You're the mountain." The figure's lips twisted into something that could have been a smile, but it was twisted, cruel, and empty. "The mountain calls," the figure whispered, and its voice, now fully Noah's, carried a sense of finality. "And you will come. You will follow." Ethan's legs shook, but he knew he couldn't back away. The mountain had been calling him. It had led him here, brought him to this point, and there was only one way forward. He had to face it. He had to fight whatever the mountain had become, even if it meant sacrificing everything. He took a deep breath, steeling himself against the unbearable cold. "I'm not following you," he said, his voice steady despite the terror rising in his chest. "I'm not like the others. You won't have me." And with that, he took a step forward, toward the figure, toward the heart of the mountain. But the figure raised the lantern, its light blinding now, so intense that it felt like it was burning through him. And in the light, Everything went black. Ethan's mind was a blur, the light from the lantern searing into his eyes, making everything else fade into the background. The mountain's presence, overwhelming and suffocating, seemed to fill every inch of his being. His breath was shallow, his chest tight, as though he was suffocating beneath the weight of the world itself. The figure before him, now nothing more than a shadow beneath the blinding glow, loomed larger, pressing closer with each passing second. For a brief, terrifying moment, Ethan wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. He could feel the mountain pulling him, urging him to surrender, to be swallowed whole by the abyss. The darkness that had consumed the lost hikers, the same darkness that had claimed Noah, now threatened to consume him as well. Every part of him screamed to run, to escape, to turn away from the figure and flee into the unknown. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. He clenched his fists, fighting back the wave of dread that threatened to crush him, and took another step forward. "I'm not afraid of you," he said through gritted teeth, though his voice trembled with the fear he could not hide. His legs were shaking, his body battered from the fall, his mind clouded with the pull of the light. But he couldn't let it win. Not like this. Not after everything. The light seemed to grow brighter, pulsing in time with the beat of his heart, the intensity of it threatening to overwhelm him. But something in Ethan refused to back down. "I will not be another soul lost to this mountain." He forced his legs to move, each step slow, deliberate, as though he were walking through water. He could feel the whispers around him, surrounding him, but they weren't the same whispers anymore. They had become pleading, desperate, like the voices of the lost hikers, the ones who had come before him. "Come closer. You must join us." "No," Ethan shouted, his voice raw, the sound of it shattering the eerie silence that had fallen over the cavern. He raised his hands, not in surrender, but in defiance, holding them out as though to block the light, to push back against the mountain's will. For a heartbeat, the cavern was silent. Then, in the space between one breath and the next, everything shifted. The mountain trembled beneath his feet again, but this time it wasn't a rumble. It was as though the very ground had cracked open, splitting the earth, opening a vast, gaping hole beneath him. The walls of the cavern seemed to distort, twisting into grotesque shapes, and for a moment, Ethan could feel himself falling through the cracks of reality itself, as though the very fabric of time was unraveling around him. He closed his eyes against the disorienting swirl of images and sounds, trying to focus on the one thing that still tethered him to this world: his breath. It came in shallow gasps, each inhale and exhale a fight against the suffocating pressure that surrounded him. When he opened his eyes again, the world had changed. The cavern was gone. The labyrinth, the shifting walls, the blinding light, they had all vanished, leaving him standing in a vast, empty space. The ground beneath him was no longer rock or dirt, but something strange, unfamiliar. It was soft, almost like sand, yet it felt unnervingly solid. The air was thick with a strange, unearthly stillness, and though he could no longer hear the whispers, the presence of the mountain still lingered. A single piercing light shone down from above, a harsh, unforgiving spotlight that illuminated the space around him. In the distance, through the shimmering air, Ethan could make out shapes, faint figures in the haze, but they were indistinct, flickering in and out of existence, as though they weren't fully there. The feeling of being watched had never been stronger. Ethan's every instinct screamed that he was being drawn into something far older, something that had been waiting for him to take this step, to cross this boundary. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice swallowed by the vast emptiness. His chest ached with the effort of trying to make sense of the space, trying to understand what he was seeing. But it was impossible. Nothing here made sense. The shapes around him flickered like ghosts, their movements so fluid and unnatural that they barely seemed to touch the ground. And then, amidst the shifting figures, he saw him, Noah. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His friend stood at the far side of the empty space, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide, hollow. His body was stiff, unmoving, as though he were frozen in place. There was no expression on his face, no recognition, no warmth. He was a ghost, a shadow, a part of this strange, timeless place. "Noah!" Ethan shouted, rushing toward him, his feet sinking into the soft ground as he moved. But the more he ran, the further Noah seemed to be. The distance between them stretched impossibly, like a cruel trick, an illusion designed to keep them apart. "Noah, please answer me." But the figure of Noah didn't respond. Instead, it stood motionless, his gaze locked ahead, as though oblivious to Ethan's presence. The light above flickered, and the ground trembled again, this time with a deeper force, shaking the very air around them. The silence in this strange realm was suffocating, but the overwhelming sense that something wasn't right had never been stronger. Ethan's mind raced, panic rising within him. He had to reach Noah. He had to save him. The figure of his friend was so close, and yet the space between them felt infinite. He pushed harder, willing his legs to carry him faster, but the harder he tried, the further Noah seemed to be. And then, just as he thought he couldn't go any further, the ground beneath him shifted again. But this time it wasn't a tremor. The ground split. A rift, dark and infinite, opened beneath his feet, a yawning void that stretched downward into nothingness. Ethan was too late to stop himself. He fell, his body tumbling into the darkness as the world around him disappeared. He screamed, the sound of it swallowed by the void as he plummeted deeper, his body twisting in mid-air. The rift wasn't just a crack in the earth, it was a tear in reality itself, a void that had existed long before him and one that would consume him, just as it had consumed all the others. There was no escape now. Noah's face was still there in his mind, still staring blankly into the distance, as though caught in the same rift that had swallowed him whole. And then, with one final deafening crack, everything vanished. Ethan's body tumbled through the void, weightless and falling faster than he could process. The air was cold, colder than anything he had ever felt, and it burned against his skin. He felt as though he were being torn apart, his body pulled in all directions at once. But there was no pain. The sensation was foreign, like he wasn't truly there at all, like he was both everywhere and nowhere. Time was meaningless here. He had no sense of how long he had been falling, but it felt like an eternity. The darkness swallowed him whole, a suffocating blackness that distorted everything. The whispers, those haunting voices that had called to him from the mountain, were gone. There was no sound, no light, no feeling, just the endless sensation of falling. His thoughts were fragmented, spinning out of control. The fear he had felt on the mountain, the terror of the unknown, all of it had melted into something deeper, an acceptance. He couldn't explain it. But in this place, it felt as though the mountain had consumed not just his body, but his soul. The reality he had once known was slipping away, the memories of his life, of Noah, fading like a dream upon waking. Then, without warning, the fall stopped. It wasn't like hitting the ground. There was no jarring impact, no shock to his body. It was like being somewhere, and yet still being nowhere. One moment, he was suspended in darkness, and the next, the world around him had shifted. The absence of sound was replaced by a strange, unnatural stillness, as though the very air itself was holding its breath. Ethan opened his eyes, but the space around him was still a blur, the shadows too thick to make sense of. He stood, though. His legs felt unsteady, like he was still drifting between two worlds. His heart hammered in his chest, the only sound in the oppressive silence. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A light, faint and flickering. His breath caught. The light, the same one that had been pulling him forward on the mountain, was here too. It hovered just at the edge of his vision, so far away, yet impossibly close. It beckoned him, just as it had on the cliffside, as though it were a guide, a sign that he was meant to follow. But there was no choice now. He knew this path, knew the pull of the light. It had been drawing him for what felt like an eternity, like the lure of a forgotten memory that he could never escape. Follow it. Come closer. The voice was soft, not in his ears, but inside his mind. It was familiar, an echo of something he couldn't quite place. It was the mountain speaking again. Its voice was like a dark lullaby, promising answers and delivering only more questions. He stepped forward, the ground beneath him soft and yielding, yet he felt no weight. The light flickered once more, its intensity growing, calling him, urging him forward. As he took each step, the world around him seemed to shift, the boundaries of reality warping and distorting. It was as though he were walking through a dream that stretched into infinity, where time no longer mattered, and the past, present, and future were all tangled together. The light pulsed faster, its glow bright and cold, but it wasn't just the lantern's light. It was a part of the mountain itself, a pulse that ran through everything. As he moved closer, the figures, those flickering shapes in the distance, came into sharper focus. They were not people. They were memories, echoes of lost souls, trapped in this place for eternity. Faces of hikers who had come before him, their eyes wide with fear, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Their hands reached toward him, but their bodies were immobile, stuck in some eternal moment between life and death. Noah was among them. Ethan's heart froze in his chest as he saw his friend's face. It was twisted, drained of color, his eyes hollow, staring at him. His mouth moved, but no sound came. He reached out, just as the others did, as though pleading with Ethan to join him. But his face, so pale, so lifeless, was a mask of despair. The figure that had once been Noah was now a part of this endless landscape of lost souls. And Ethan realized with a sickening twist in his stomach, Noah had become part of the mountain's hunger. No, Ethan whispered, his voice broken, his body trembling. He wanted to reach out, to call to his friend, to pull him back from whatever had consumed him, but he couldn't. The moment his eyes met Noah's, a coldness swept over him, as though the truth had finally broken through. The mountain had won. Noah had joined it, and there was no going back. Ethan turned away, the weight of the realization pressing down on him. He had been drawn here, just as the others had been. The light was not a guide. It was a trap, a lure that had ensnared them all. The mountain fed on their souls, trapping them in this limbo forever. And now it wanted him too. The light pulsed brighter, as if urging him to take the final step. But Ethan knew the truth now. The light wasn't salvation. It was the end. He stepped back, away from the figures, from the light. He couldn't follow it. He wouldn't. There had to be another way out. There had to be something, anything, that could break the cycle. And then, as if in response to his defiance, the mountain trembled. The ground beneath him split again, a crack opening in the earth, and for a moment, the entire space around him seemed to warp, as if time itself was bending in on itself. The figures of the lost souls shifted, their movements becoming more erratic, more frantic. The whispers grew louder, their voices colliding, becoming a deafening roar in his ears. He could hear their cries now, not just as whispers, but as screams, screams of agony, of fear, of being trapped for all eternity. Ethan's legs buckled beneath him as the ground shifted once more. The figures, those hollowed-out remnants of the lost, reached for him with clawed hands, their eyes wild with desperation. "Help us," The words were not spoken aloud. They were in his mind, his soul. The mountain's hunger was insatiable, and it had already claimed so much. But as Ethan closed his eyes, a single thought pierced through the chaos. A thought so simple, so undeniable, that it cut through the darkness like a shard of light. The mountain could not have him. Not yet. With every ounce of strength he could summon, Ethan pushed against the pull of the light, the whispers and the shadows. He pulled himself away from the figures, away from Noah, from the suffocating embrace of the mountain. It wasn't enough to run. It wasn't enough to fight. He had to do more. He had to reject it. He took one last breath and screamed into the darkness, the words an explosion of defiance and desperation. "I am not yours." The ground shook violently as the cavern around him began to collapse, the walls cracking and shattering as if the mountain itself was breaking apart. The light flickered, dimmed, and then faded. The silence returned, this time not oppressive, but final. Ethan was still standing. The cavern had vanished, and with it, the figures, the light, the mountain's suffocating presence. He was alone. But for the first time since entering the mountains, the air felt clear. The oppressive weight that had filled his chest for so long was gone. And in that moment, he realized something else. He hadn't just escaped the mountain. He had changed. The path was no longer clear. The mountain had taken what it wanted, but it had failed to claim him. The figures of the lost souls, the whispers, the light, they had faded but not gone. They would linger forever, a part of the mountain, part of its hunger, until it found another to claim. Ethan took a tentative step forward, his body exhausted, but his mind clear. The journey was far from over. There were still truths to uncover, still mysteries to face, but for now, for this brief fleeting moment, he was free, and the mountain had no claim over him. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The storm arrived with unnatural speed, a harbinger that no one had expected. The sun had only just dipped behind the mountain peaks, its golden light draining from the sky when the clouds began to gather. Thick, dark swirls of vapor coiled around the winter mountains, pulling the world into an unsettling silence. Birds had stopped their calls. The wind, once mild and gentle, began to pick up, thrashing through the pine trees, snapping branches like brittle bones. Ethan stared up at the blackening sky, narrowing his eyes against the weight of the coming rain. The climbers, 5 in total, had made excellent progress throughout the day, the rock faces that had once seemed daunting now far behind them. But in this moment, the mountain felt less like a triumph and more like a threat. The ominous roll of thunder echoed in the distance, and Ethan's gut twisted in unease. "We need shelter," Ethan said, his voice low, commanding. Beside him, Melissa, the youngest of the group, nervously adjusted the strap of her backpack. Her cheeks were flushed from exertion, but there was an undeniable flicker of anxiety in her eyes. She glanced nervously at the sky, her breath quickening. "I thought we had another hour before it hit," she murmured, pulling her hood tighter. "We don't have an hour," Ethan replied sharply, scanning the jagged landscape ahead. The cliff faces that had guided them on their climb had now become treacherous, slick with rain that began to trickle down in rivulets. His mind raced, trying to map out a course. Jasper, a wiry man with a perpetual look of mischief on his face, offered a grin that seemed too bright given the circumstances. "Hey, if it gets too bad, we can always turn around, right? We'll be back at the base in no time." But even as he spoke, the first drops began to fall, and with them came a sudden biting chill. Ethan didn't respond. He was already searching for cover. The mountain was a place of beauty, but it could quickly turn into something much darker. This storm wasn't the kind you outrun. It was the kind that found you. "Look!" shouted Tom, pointing ahead. A shadowy opening in the rock appeared before them, half concealed by the cascading rain. A cave. It was small, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, but it was shelter. Without another word, they moved toward it, slipping and stumbling over the slick ground, the rain pouring down in torrents. Each step seemed to echo in the silent mountain air, as if the world itself held its breath, waiting for something. They reached the mouth of the cave, and for a moment, the storm felt like a memory. It was as if the wind and rain had been swallowed up by the dark, cool air within. The heavy scent of damp earth filled their noses, and the faintest chill gripped their skin. The shadows inside stretched long, bending and shifting as the last remnants of sunlight struggled to break through the storm's veil. One by one, they crawled into the cave, their wet clothes sticking to their bodies. Once inside, Ethan found a dry patch on the cave floor and began to unpack his gear. The others followed suit, huddling together in silence. Ethan looked back at the entrance. The storm outside was already growing violent, the sky a shifting mass of dark, foreboding clouds. He knew they couldn't leave, not now. "Let's set up a fire," he suggested, already moving toward his pack. "Agreed," Melissa added, her voice a little shakier than usual. Within moments, a small fire was crackling, sending soft, warm tendrils of light into the otherwise dark space. The orange flames threw wild shadows on the cave walls, distorting the jagged edges of the rock into sinister shapes. Ethan could feel the tension begin to ease. The warmth of the fire, the sound of the storm outside, the familiar movements of his friends. It almost felt like nothing had changed. But something was wrong. As Ethan sat near the fire, feeling the heat lick at his fingers, he noticed something strange. The walls, which had seemed like ordinary rock at first glance, were not quite as plain as they appeared. There was something on them, something he hadn't seen before. The flickering light of the fire revealed faint marks, smudged into the stone. Handprints. At first, Ethan dismissed it as a trick of the light, the result of the fire's shifting glow. But as the flames stabilized, the marks became clearer. Thousands of them, streaks of dark red and brown that marred the otherwise smooth surface of the cave's interior. Some were small, barely more than a child's imprint. Others were large and smeared as if someone had pressed their entire palm against the rock in haste. He frowned, his curiosity piqued. Are those handprints? Melissa's voice trembled slightly as she leaned over, her eyes wide. Ethan nodded slowly. It looks like it. But the oddest part wasn't the handprints themselves. It was the fact that some of them were fresh, wet to the touch, their outlines still dark and damp as if they had only just been made. His fingers hovered above one, testing the temperature of the rock. It was warm. Too warm for something that should have been a relic of ages past. The others gathered around, their faces contorted with a mixture of fascination and dread. Who would leave these here? Jasper asked, his usual bravado now lacking, replaced by unease. The others murmured their agreement. None of them had noticed this cave before, and yet these marks didn't belong to anyone from their group. They were too strange, too different. The size, the way they were smeared. It wasn't natural. It could be a prank, Tom suggested, though even he didn't sound convinced. Maybe some hikers did this. Ethan shook his head. Not like this. No way. He walked closer to the wall, inspecting the handprints. Some of them were so deep, so ingrained into the stone, that they seemed part of it. He touched the rock. Again, running his fingers over the marks. Something about them sent a chill down his spine, as if they were more than just human. That one, Melissa said, pointing. Her voice was soft, but there was something insistent in it. It's different. Ethan turned his gaze to where she was pointing. There, slightly above the others, was a handprint that stood out from the rest. It was larger than the others, the fingers elongated, almost inhuman. It was darker too, like it had been pressed into the stone with a force that had left a permanent scar. Ethan swallowed hard. That wasn't made by a person, he muttered under his breath. Before anyone could respond, there was a faint sound in the distance, an odd scraping, like the drag of something heavy against rock. The noise grew louder, reverberating through the cave. Everyone froze. "What is that?" Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. Ethan stood up abruptly, his heart pounding in his chest. "Stay here," he ordered. He moved quickly toward the cave's narrow entrance, his footsteps muffled against the stone. He peered outside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The storm was still raging, but through the wind and rain, he thought he saw something. A shadow just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was a figure, tall and thin, moving slowly toward the cave. Ethan's blood ran cold. There was something wrong with this place. Something ancient, something that had been waiting for them. Before he could react, the shadow disappeared. The wind howled again, and the scraping noise stopped. But the sense of dread remained. The moment the shadow vanished, the storm outside seemed to intensify. The wind howled with a ferocity that rattled the cave's jagged walls, and the rain lashed against the stone with an unnatural force. Ethan's heart raced in his chest as he stepped back from the cave entrance, his eyes darting to the others, who were now watching him with wide, questioning eyes. "What was that?" Melissa asked, her voice trembling. She took a hesitant step toward Ethan, her body rigid with anxiety. Ethan swallowed, still unable to shake the image of the tall figure from his mind. The way it had moved, slow, deliberate, like it was aware of their presence but also detached, as if it didn't care whether they lived or died. I don't know," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But something's not right here. We need to stay alert." A few moments of silence passed before Tom spoke, his voice strained. "That figure, it wasn't a person, was it?" Ethan shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "No, it wasn't. We're not alone in here." For a brief moment, it seemed as if the storm outside had swallowed the world whole. The cave, with its damp walls and oppressive darkness, felt almost suffocating. The shadows around the fire flickered unnervingly, twisting and reshaping themselves into grotesque, inhuman forms that made Ethan's skin crawl. His gaze flicked back to the handprints on the walls, those thousands of marks that had once seemed like nothing more than an oddity. But now, they felt like a warning. "Look at them," Melissa said quietly, her voice a mere breath against the thick, musty air. She pointed toward the handprints again, her finger trembling. They're changing." Ethan's heart clenched, and he looked over at the wall, his breath catching in his throat. As if to prove her words, the handprints seemed to shift under the flickering light of the fire. The fresh ones, the ones that had appeared damp earlier, now appeared to be oozing, a strange, almost oily substance seeping from them like sweat from a fevered brow. It trickled down the rock, pooling in small puddles at the base of the cave. The air grew thick, stifling, and Ethan had to fight to maintain his composure. But the worst part wasn't the strange liquid. It was the sound, a soft whisper, like the rustling of paper or the wind whispering through dry leaves. It came from the walls themselves, as if the handprints were alive. Ethan couldn't explain it, but the words were there, buried beneath the surface of the sound. "Help me! Get out! It's too late! Did you hear that?" Jasper asked, his voice shaky. Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the wall. Yeah, I hear it, but I don't know what it means. The whispering grew louder, almost unbearable, filling his mind with a cold, gnawing dread. His heartbeat quickened, and he suddenly felt very small, as if the walls of the cave were closing in on him. It was as if the cave itself were alive, feeding on their fear, drawing them deeper into its unseen maw. "We need to get out," Melissa said, her voice a frantic whisper now, her wide eyes darting around the cave as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "This place, it's wrong." Ethan glanced at her, his face pale. He wanted to tell her she was right, to run, to escape from whatever presence had found them here. But the storm outside was still relentless, and there was no way to survive the treacherous terrain in the dark, not with the mountain faces slick and the wind howling in fury. They were trapped, and it was as if the mountain itself knew it. "No," Ethan said firmly, trying to steady his breath. "We're staying here for now. The storm's too bad. We can't go out there. But we'll figure this out. We have to." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. The shadows were deepening, the whispers were growing louder, and the handprints, those grotesque marks, seemed to multiply by the second. He could feel it in his bones, deep in his soul. Something was waiting. Something was watching. The fire crackled and popped, but its warmth offered no comfort. The group sat huddled together, shivering not from the cold, but from something darker, more primal. The walls around them seemed to pulse with energy, their jagged edges shifting in the light, like claws reaching out from the stone itself. Ethan had seen caves like this before, but nothing had ever felt like this. It was as if the very rock itself had been molded by something ancient, something that had waited eons to be disturbed. He couldn't shake the feeling that the cave was a trap, its sinister nature masked by the storm that had driven them in. And yet, it wasn't just the physical space that frightened him. It was the growing realization that the handprints were not just marks. They were a message, a warning, or perhaps a record of something far worse. The firelight flickered once, more casting a brief, sinister shadow across the wall. For a brief moment, Ethan thought he saw movement in the darkness near the cave entrance, but when he blinked, it was gone. "Let's look for a way out," Jasper suggested, his voice shaky, as if he too felt the pressure of the unseen presence, closing in on them. "We have to find another exit. We can't just sit here waiting for whatever that is." Ethan nodded, but before he could make a move, something shifted in the corner of his eye. A shape, dark and indistinct, lingered near the wall, just beyond the firelight's reach. It was like a shadow that didn't belong, a figure that seemed almost human, yet entirely wrong. "Did anyone else see that?" Ethan asked, his voice rising in panic. They all turned to look, but whatever it was had vanished into the darkness, leaving only the flickering light of the fire and the oppressive silence. But then, as if in response to their fear, the whispering returned, louder now, more urgent. "They came before you. You won't be the last." A cold chill ran down Ethan's spine. His fingers clenched into fists as he stepped forward, scanning the cave once more. There had to be a way out. But he was beginning to suspect that even if they found one, the mountain would not release them so easily. The handprints on the walls seemed to pulse, to ripple with a life of their own. They weren't just marks anymore. They were watching. They were listening. The dark liquid, now pooling in the base of the cave, began to spread, creeping across the floor in slow, deliberate motions. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he crouched beside it, inspecting the dark liquid. It wasn't like anything he had seen before. It was thick, viscous, and shimmered under the firelight with an unnatural iridescence. "Is it blood?" Tom asked, his voice strained. Ethan reached out a hand to touch it, and the moment his fingers brushed against the liquid, a searing pain shot through him. The burn was instantaneous, like touching fire, but there was no flame. The pain spread up his arm, racing through his veins like liquid ice until it reached his chest, constricting his lungs. He gasped, stumbling back, but the sensation didn't fade. He yanked his hand away, but the sensation of burning, of something clawing at him from the inside, lingered. His heart pounded in his ears, and his breath came in short, shallow gasps. "Ethan, are you okay?" Melissa's voice was filled with panic, but it sounded distant, muffled, as if the walls were closing in around him. I don't know," Ethan muttered, struggling to breathe, his eyes wide with fear. "Something's in there. Something's in the rock." And as if in response to his words, the handprints, those awful marks, shifted once more, slowly, deliberately, as if they had a mind of their own. They seemed to grow darker, more pronounced, until they resembled nothing human at all. They were shapes, symbols, markings, older than anything he could comprehend. Then, the walls whispered once more. "It is." Too late, you cannot leave. The air in the cave had grown heavier, suffocating, pressing against Ethan's chest like an unseen weight. His hand still throbbed from the touch of the strange liquid, and the pain was a constant reminder that whatever was happening here wasn't just supernatural. It was something ancient, something that had been waiting, watching, waiting for them. "Ethan?" Melissa's voice was strained, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that? What's happening?" He shook his head, the fog of confusion clouding his thoughts. "I don't know, but we need to stay calm. We need to figure out what this is." The whispering in the cave grew louder, an unnerving chorus of voices now, too many to count. Each whispered word, each hushed plea, seemed to mingle with the crackling sound of the fire, until it was impossible to tell where the fire ended and the voices began. His ears rang, and his thoughts blurred together in a chaotic rush. The others sat in uneasy silence, their faces pale and strained, trying to make sense of it all. But Ethan knew they couldn't stay here. This place, the handprints, the whispers, the strange liquid, wasn't just a freak occurrence. It was a manifestation of something much darker, much older, and whatever it wasn't content to let them leave. Ethan stood up abruptly, brushing off the pain in his chest as he made his way toward the back of the cave. His gaze darted from one part of the rock wall to another. There had to be something more to this place, something that would explain the presence they felt, something that would help them understand why they had been drawn here. The handprints, the voice, they were part of a story, one they had yet to uncover. As his fingers ran over the damp rock, he stumbled upon something more. At first it was just a faint line, like an etching, barely visible in the low light. But as he leaned in closer, the markings began to take shape. Crude, but unmistakably deliberate. These weren't just carvings. They were words, or perhaps names. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he read the first one. Jonas Hart. The name was etched into the stone with a precision that seemed too deliberate for the rough stone surface. It was clear, almost freshly, carved, and next to it was a date, March 13th, 2023. It made no sense. Jonas Hart was one of the names from the handprints, one of the most recent ones. He had seen it etched on the wall earlier, along with the date from more than 100 years ago. He traced his fingers over the name, and as he did, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. Jonas Hart, March 13th. The voice seemed to repeat the name over and over, like a broken record, as if it were echoing from the walls themselves. "Ethan, stop!" Melissa's voice pierced through the murmur of whispers, but it was too late. The air shifted around him as he continued to trace the carvings. A cold breeze, unnatural for a cave, swept through the tunnel. The whispers turned to a low growl, a threatening tone that seemed to wrap itself around him. He jerked his hand back, his breath caught in his throat. But it wasn't just the sound that made him recoil. It was the deep, unsettling feeling that flooded him. There were more names. He stepped back, his eyes scanning the surface of the wall. It was a list, each name carved into the rock like a ledger, and beneath each name, a date. Some were old, far too old. Some were recent, like the one he had just found. But as he read through the names, his heart sank. March 13th, 1897. Samuel Blackwell. August 22nd, 1961. Catherine O'Neill. October 5th, 2020. And then, near the end of the list, another date that made his blood run cold. November 2nd, 2023. It was less than 2 weeks ago. He glanced over at the others, their eyes wide with horror. "Those are the people who came before us," Melissa whispered, her voice quivering. The ones who didn't make it out." Ethan felt a wave of nausea wash over him. His legs were weak and his mind was reeling. These names, they were more than just etched into the rock. They were a history of people who had come to this place seeking shelter or adventure and had never left. A history of people who had disappeared without a trace. "Who is this?" Tom's voice was tight, filled with disbelief. "Jonas Hart, he's one of us, right?" Ethan looked at the name again, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The carving was new. It was still fresh in a way that made his skin crawl. The ink-like substance beneath it was still damp to the touch. But the others on the list, they were older, weathered, faded as if they had been carved centuries ago. And then it hit him. The pieces clicked together, though he wished they hadn't. Jonas Hart. He was the person who had written his name in this cursed place. And yet, he had never left. His handprints had been found on the wall, and now his name was carved deep into the stone. Was it possible that Jonas had somehow written his name here before he died? Had he left some sort of record? And what about the others? Had they been summoned here as he had been? Were they fated to become part of this dark ledger, to have their names etched in this cursed cave for eternity? The whispers grew louder still. "Who's next? Who's next?" Ethan's chest tightened, and his throat went dry. He turned to the others, who were watching him, wide-eyed, too frightened to speak. They understood now. They weren't just trapped in a cave. They were trapped in a pattern, a horrific cycle of people who had been here before them, who had left behind their marks, their names, and their fates. And now, it was their turn. Ethan backed away from the wall, his eyes flicking over the other carvings, scanning the names, searching for something, anything that could offer an explanation. But there was nothing, only more names, more dates. The darkness around him seemed to press closer, tightening its grip. "What do we do?" Melissa's voice broke through the suffocating silence, her hands wringing together in fear. "What's happening to us, Ethan?" Ethan stood frozen. The weight of what was happening was finally settling in. The storm outside, the handprints on the walls, the whispers in the air, all of it was connected. But how? Why? And how could they escape? A shiver ran down his spine as he turned back to the wall. And then, just as he was about to speak, a new carving appeared before his eyes, one that hadn't been there a moment ago. Ethan Richards, and beneath it, the date, November 14th, 2023. It was his name, his own name. The blood drained from his face as he stared at the fresh carving, barely able to comprehend the meaning. Was this his future? Was it already too late for him? Too late for all of them? A low rumble of thunder echoed from outside the cave, but it seemed distant now, as if the storm were closing in on them from within. The walls seemed to hum, and the whispers rose to a crescendo, drowning out everything else. And as the cave seemed to pulse with energy, a voice, deep and ancient, whispered, "You are already one of us." Ethan couldn't look away from the newly carved name. His heart hammered in his chest as he stepped back, stumbling over his feet. The others gathered around him, their eyes wide with terror, their gazes flickering from his face to the freshly etched letters on the wall. "Ethan, that's impossible," Melissa breathed, her voice barely audible, as if speaking any louder might shatter the fragile illusion that this was just some nightmare. That's not real." But it was real. The name was his. The date was current. It was as though the very rock had drawn his fate in front of them, a grim prophecy that could not be undone. "What the hell is happening?" Tom whispered, his voice a ragged rasp. He was visibly trembling now, his face pale beneath the cold light of the fire. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He had no explanation, no way to make sense of it. All he could hear was the whispering, growing louder, more insistent with each passing second. "You are already one of us." It wasn't just the voice, it was a presence. Something in the air seemed to shift, something that was watching them from all directions, as if the walls themselves had eyes. Ethan's skin prickled, goosebumps breaking out across his arms as the sense of being trapped deepened. There was no way out, not now. Not with the storm still raging outside, not with this thing pulling them deeper into the mountain's heart. "Ethan, we need to leave," Melissa said urgently, her eyes darting between him and the now ominous wall. "That name, it's not a coincidence. We're not supposed to be here. We need to get out before it's too late." But Ethan knew deep down that they weren't going to escape this. This was no longer a simple storm or a random act of fate. The mountain, the cave, it had claimed them. They were part of something much older, something that had been waiting for them long before they ever set foot on this cursed land. "Ethan, look!" Jasper's voice pierced through his spiraling thoughts, and Ethan turned toward him. Jasper was standing near the farthest wall of the cave, his hand hovering above something that had been hidden in the shadows. As the others crowded around him, their faces pale with dread, they could see it. More carvings. The stone, once smooth, was now covered in intricate symbols, ones that Ethan couldn't recognize, but their form was unnerving. These weren't just names. They were shapes, geometric and unnatural, as if the rock itself had been torn open to reveal something hidden beneath, something ancient. As his fingers traced over one of the markings, a low, rumbling sound filled the cave, like the deep groan of an old, dying beast stirring in its sleep. Ethan froze, his pulse thundering in his ears. There was something else, something more than just the carvings, something alive. "Did you hear that?" Melissa whispered, her breath shallow as her wide eyes searched the dark corners of the cave. "I felt it," Tom said, his voice barely more than a breath. "It's like something's waking up." The air was thick now, stifling. Each breath felt like it was being pulled from his chest, and Ethan found it harder and harder to move. The whispers, once faint, were now a cacophony, voices calling out from every corner, from the very walls themselves. "Wake up, Ethan Richards. You belong here now." The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, as if the mountain was shifting. It wasn't the storm, nor the wind, but something far deeper, something beneath them, something old, ancient, and then, as if in response to the trembling, the darkness seemed to grow. From the stone, shadows began to bleed. At first, they were faint, wispy trails that spiraled from the cracks in the walls, creeping along the floor like a slow-moving fog. But as the shadows thickened, they coiled tighter, rising from the ground like smoke from an unseen fire. The shadows began to take shape. At first they were formless, undulating like an ink spill on water. But then, as the shape grew more defined, Ethan saw it. The figure, tall, dark, and malevolent, loomed before them, its outline jagged and broken, like a silhouette too large to fully contain in the small space of the cave. The whispers escalated into a low, guttural growl, and the air grew colder still, biting through their clothing, chilling their bones. The figure in the shadows was no longer an abstract shape. It had substance now, shifting, breathing in slow, rhythmic waves, its presence suffocating. It was watching them. "I told you," the voice hissed, its tone sharp and filled with malice. "You should have never come here." Ethan stumbled backward, his breath coming in quick gasps. The figure's eyes, glowing faintly, were pools of darkness. They seemed to peer into him, into his very soul, and he felt as though his body was shrinking beneath its gaze. The feeling of being powerless washed over him, suffocating in its intensity. We have to get out of here," Melissa's voice cracked. She grabbed Ethan's arm, her grip tight and trembling. "We need to leave now." But before they could react, the shadows surged forward, tendrils of dark smoke wrapping around their ankles, their wrists, pulling them toward the walls of the cave. It was like something alive, something that fed off their fear and desperation. "No," Jasper shouted, tugging at the shadowy tendrils, his face contorted in a mix of terror and defiance. But it was no use. The shadows pulled him closer, his feet dragging across the cold stone floor. The cave seemed to pulse, and the figure in the darkness stepped forward, its shape flickering like a candle in a draught. As it moved, the walls began to shift. The carved names of the lost, the dates, the symbols, everything, began to bleed together into a single unified pattern. Ethan's breath hitched as he realized what it was. It was a map of the cave, of the labyrinth beneath the mountain, a map that led deeper and deeper into the earth. The lost souls of those who had come before were drawn here, trapped, etched into the walls as part of a twisted ritual. "You belong here now," the figure whispered, its voice hollow, echoing in Ethan's mind. "You will leave your name too. You will be one of us." Panic surged through Ethan's chest, and he tried to pull free from the suffocating shadows, but they wrapped tighter around him, holding him in place. He could feel his strength waning, his vision blurring at the edges as the shadows began to pull him toward the ground. The whispers intensified, a chorus of voices now all calling his name, begging him to accept his fate. "No!" Ethan cried out, his voice breaking. He reached for Melissa, who was struggling against the dark tendrils with all her strength, but her hand slipped from his. And then, suddenly, the world went cold. An overwhelming pressure bore down on them from all directions, pushing them into the stone beneath. Everything stopped. The fire flickered one final time, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The figure loomed over them now, towering above them, as the darkness seemed to close in from all sides. And then, with a low, terrible voice that reverberated through the walls of the cave, it spoke again. "There is no escape." Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps, as the suffocating pressure of the darkness pressed down around him, crushing him from all sides. He could feel the cold tendrils of the shadow wrapping tighter around his chest, pulling him deeper into the stone beneath him, as if the mountain itself was claiming him. His limbs felt heavy, numb, as though they were no longer his own, and the whispering, those eerie voices, had become a maddening roar in his mind. "There is no escape," the figure growled, its voice low and reverberating like a distant thunderclap. Shaking the walls of the cave, Ethan's heart hammered wildly in his chest. His hands flailed against the unseen force that bound him, the stone cold beneath his fingertips, but he couldn't break free. No escape. The words rang in his head, drowning out everything else. Melissa's scream pierced the air, raw with terror. "Ethan!" She was struggling too, her eyes wide with panic. But she too was trapped by the shadows. The tendrils twisted around her body, pulling her towards the cave walls. "Help me!" she screamed. But the shadows seemed to mock her, bending around her, smothering her words in their thick, suffocating grip. Jasper and Tom weren't faring any better. Their attempts to break free were futile. Their limbs jerked and writhed, as though their bodies were no longer their own, as if the darkness had taken root in them, twisted and corrupted them. Ethan's vision blurred. The shadows were now crawling across the walls, creeping ever closer. The figure loomed larger, casting a horrible, otherworldly shadow that seemed to stretch across the cave itself, obscuring the firelight. And as the figure moved closer, Ethan could feel the coldness grow deeper, more suffocating. The whispering in the walls grew louder, the voices not just in his head anymore, but coming from all around them. "You're already one of us." Ethan couldn't fight the panic rising in his throat, the suffocating fear that he was losing himself, losing his will, his soul. He thought of the carving on the wall, the one with his name. November 14th, 2023. His name etched into the stone, marked as one of the lost, and the whispers said it all. "You belong here now." The figure moved closer, now nearly hovering over them. Its form was distorted, as though it were both a part of the shadows and separate from them, shifting, flickering, like smoke in the wind. Its eyes glowed faintly, pools of black emptiness, sucking in the light, drawing in everything around them. Ethan couldn't look away. It was a gaze that dug into his very soul, making him feel small, insignificant, as if he had never been more than a passing thought. "You will be part of the ledger," the figure crooned, its voice like broken glass scraping over stone. "You are nothing but another name." The words sank into Ethan's chest, burning, as though they were searing him from the inside out. His heart thudded painfully, his skin crawling beneath the weight of the figure's gaze. And then everything changed. The whispers, the suffocating darkness, the pulling shadows, they stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath. The figure's presence receded for a brief moment, as though something had distracted it. The heavy silence that followed was worse than the chaos. It was as though the very air around them had frozen, time had stopped, and there was no escape from the suffocating stillness that wrapped around them like a shroud. And then, just as quickly as the shadows had overtaken them, the ground began to tremble again. But this time, there was something different about it. The tremors shook the walls, sending shards of stone crashing to the floor around them. And deep in the heart of the cave, there was a sound of something ancient and terrible awakening. It was a rumble, a groan, a deep, soul-chilling sound that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself, as though the cave was alive, as though the entire mountain was alive. And it was not pleased. The shadows receded slowly at first, retreating into the cracks, from where they had emerged, but not entirely. There were whispers in the air, faint murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. "Ethan," a voice whispered, a voice that was familiar yet strange. "Ethan." He turned toward the sound, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't the figure. It wasn't the whispering in the walls. No, this voice came from somewhere else. His head spun, and as his eyes focused on the shadowy outline in front of him, he saw it. A shape, smaller than the figure. A figure barely visible in the low firelight standing at the edge of the cave. It was a person, a man. He was tall and thin, with long black hair that fell in strands across his face. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, those eyes, burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce through everything around them. He stood motionless, his posture stiff, as if frozen in time. And then the man spoke, Jonas Hart, the Utai. Name rang out like a bell, clear and reverberating through the cave. Ethan's stomach lurched. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He remembered the carving, Jonas Hart, March 13th, 2023. This man, this pale figure, he was the same one. The one whose name had been carved into the stone. The one who had been here before him, lost to the cave's curse, Jonas Hart. He had been the last one, the most recent. But now here he was, still here, still waiting. You don't understand, do you? Jonas said, his voice a low rasp, barely more than a whisper. His eyes, hollow and unblinking, never left Ethan's. You never understand until it's too late. Ethan's mouth went dry. What do you mean? What do you want from us? Jonas took a slow step forward, the shadows seeming to pulse with his every movement. The cave has no mercy. It never lets go. You think you can escape. You think you can leave before your name is carved into its walls, but you can't. We're all part of it now. All of us who entered. You are already here. You will become part of the stone, part of the darkness. No, Ethan whispered, his mind racing, trying to comprehend, trying to find a way out, a way to save them. He turned to Melissa, but her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. But there was no time. Jonas's voice filled his head again, louder now, more insistent. There's no escape, Ethan, not for you, not for anyone who comes. The cave shook again, this time harder. The walls trembled violently as the air grew thick with a terrible, suffocating pressure. Ethan could feel it in his chest, a heaviness that threatened to crush him. The mountain itself was waking up, and it was angry. Suddenly the world went dark. The shadows surged again, thicker now, crawling across the walls, the floor, reaching for them. And in the midst of it all, the voices grew louder, growing, swelling, chanting their names. The walls seemed to shift, the names and dates blending together, becoming an endless, swirling spiral. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came. His breath was stolen from him, as if the very air had been choked out, and then everything faded to black. The darkness swallowed them whole. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no light, just the oppressive weight of an empty void pressing in on Ethan from every direction. It was as though the cave, the mountain, the very earth itself, had closed its jaws around them. He couldn't feel his body, couldn't hear his thoughts. His mind, desperate and frantic, struggled to make sense of what was happening, but there was no clarity. Only a numb, suffocating blackness that seemed to stretch on for eternity. But then, as if from the deepest pit of his consciousness, there was a flicker of light, a cold, flickering glimmer that barely pierced the suffocating void. And along with it came a sound, a faint whisper so soft at first that it seemed to come from a great distance. "You're not alone." The voice was familiar, but it wasn't one he recognized. It was cold, hollow, like an echo from some faraway place. A place beyond time. It was the kind of voice you couldn't forget, no matter how much you tried to drown it out. Ethan's thoughts began to crystallize again, slow at first, like a fog lifting from his mind. He could feel the cold air against his skin, the weight of the darkness around him, but beneath it all, there was a faint pulse, a rhythmic hum, a vibration deep within the stone. "It's not too late," the voice whispered, louder now, insistent. Suddenly, the cave came into view, flickering shadows, hazy and warped, as if seen through a pane of ice. The figures of his friends were there, standing in silence, their eyes wide and empty, like hollow vessels. They were frozen, not in place, but suspended, as if caught between two worlds, their bodies rigid and still. Ethan reached out, his hand trembling, and tried to move toward them. but the air around him resisted. It was thick, heavy, as though the very atmosphere had been thickened by the cave's curse. His limbs felt stiff, almost unmovable. Panic surged in his chest, but the voice continued, its cold whisper cutting through his mind. "You must listen. The price must be paid." The shadows around him stirred. Ethan felt them pressing in on him, wrapping around his legs, his arms, his neck, tightening, squeezing like a noose. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something that made his blood freeze. It was the figure, Jonas Hart. Jonas wasn't standing anymore. He was crouched on the ground, his long, pale fingers digging into the stone, his mouth moving, but no sound escaping. His body was twisted, like something caught between the physical and the spectral, his form flickering in and out of existence. His face was a mask of desperation, his eyes locked on Ethan. "There is no escape," Jonas's voice rasped, his words a sharp, cutting whisper. "You have already paid the price." Ethan's breath hitched as he looked at Jonas, the realization slowly sinking in like poison. He understood now, the figure, the whispers, the carvings on the wall. It was all connected, all part of an ancient, unyielding cycle that had ensnared them, one after the other. Jonas hadn't just been here before him, he had been consumed by it. And now, so had Ethan, so had they all. The ground trembled again, but this time it wasn't just a passing tremor. It was deeper, stronger, as if something massive was awakening beneath their feet. The walls of the cave groaned, their voices rising in a cacophony of whispers, names, dates, promises, warnings, all swirling together in a single terrible chorus. "It has begun," the voice hissed in his mind. "You cannot leave. You must stay." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the figure of Jonas seemed to dissolve into the shadows, his form bleeding away into the darkness like ink in water. And then, with a sickening, nauseating lurch, the shadows withdrew from Ethan's body, leaving him standing in the center of the cave, alone, but not truly alone. The shadows had not left him. They were inside him now. They were a part of him. The cave seemed to breathe around him, alive, ancient, watching. Ethan's eyes burned as he scanned the walls, now covered with the names and dates of all those who had come before him, all those who had been trapped in this endless cycle. He could see the faintest impression of his own name there, beside the others. Ethan Richards. The date beside it was fresh, no longer just a carving. It was real, it was now. He had become a part of the mountain. "This is the price," the Gub voice whispered, its tone dark and final. "This is what it takes, a soul for a soul." Ethan's chest tightened as the weight of the curse settled over him. He had been chosen. They all had. They had entered the cave seeking refuge from the storm, from the mountain. But it had been a trap all along. A trap set by something ancient, something beyond their comprehension, and now they were part of it. They were part of the darkness. He turned to face his friends, but they were gone, no longer standing at the edges of the cave, no longer frozen in place. They had vanished, as though they had never been there at all, leaving behind nothing but the cold, empty space where they had stood. The whispering had stopped, and all that remained was the echo of the curse, the echo of their names. And then, as if drawn by some unseen force, Ethan turned toward the farthest corner of the cave. There, etched into the stone, was a new set of carvings. Fresh, just like his. But these names were different. They were not yet marked, not yet claimed, but they would be soon. "You're already one of us," the voice said, now clearer than ever before, echoing through the walls, reverberating in Ethan's skull. "There's no turning back. Your fate is sealed." With a final resounding pulse, the shadows closed in on him once more, and Ethan felt his body go cold, his thoughts grow distant. He was no longer entirely sure where the cave ended and he began. He was part of it now, just as the others had been. They had all been consumed, their names etched into the rock, bound forever to the dark pulse of the mountain. And as the shadows closed in, the last thing Ethan heard was a whisper, barely a breath. Who's next? The darkness hung heavy in the cave, a blanket smothering everything around Ethan. His body was no longer his own. It felt as though his very soul had been worn down, stretched thin, and consumed by the mountain. The whispers, so faint at first, now filled the air with their relentless call. They surrounded him like an oppressive mist, pressing against his skin, filling his lungs, choking him with their insistent murmurings. "You're one of us now." Ethan's mind seemed to fracture as the words echoed in his skull. The figure, Jonas, Hart, his face, those hollow eyes, they lingered in his thoughts. The terrible truth hung in the air like a thick fog. He wasn't just trapped in the cave. He had become a part of it, woven into its fabric, a thread in the tapestry of souls that had been devoured by this cursed place. His feet moved on their own, dragging him deeper into the cave. He didn't remember deciding to move, but his body was being pulled forward, drawn inexorably into the mountain's heart. He could hear his breath shallow and ragged, as if his lungs were still trying to cling to life. But the whispers in the walls, the names, the dates, were becoming louder, the sounds of the lost souls trapped in the stone, forever echoing through time. Ethan stumbled over the uneven ground, his hands reaching out, blindly searching for something solid to hold onto. The firelight from earlier had long since flickered out, leaving only the faintest traces of light to guide his way. But the deeper he went, the darker it became, the more the shadows pressed in, thicker, colder, as if the mountain itself were alive, feeding on the fear that had taken root in his chest. The walls here were different. They weren't smooth like they had been at the entrance. The rock seemed jagged, cracked open in places, as if something had once tried to break free. The further he went, the more it felt like the mountain itself was speaking, whispering in a language that was ancient, lost to time. He could feel the pulse of the cave beneath his feet, a rhythmic thrum that seemed to vibrate through the air, through his bones. "They came before you," the whispers murmured, growing louder and more urgent. "They left their names, and so will you." The names, the ones carved into the stone. They were all around him, swirling in his mind, mixing with the new carvings that appeared each time someone was claimed by the cave. Ethan's own name had been added. He had become part of the record, his soul now entwined with those who had been taken before him. He had become one of the names on the wall, and as he moved deeper into the labyrinth, he understood that his fate, like theirs, was sealed. The walls narrowed, and the shadows grew darker still, suffocating him with their presence. The air was thick, damp and heavy with the scent of earth and decay. As he moved forward, his eyes caught something in the dark, a faint glimmer of light, barely visible, like the flickering flame of a candle. He moved toward it instinctively, though every part of him screamed that he should turn back, that he should fight against the pull of the cave. But there was no fighting it. He had already been chosen. The light grew stronger as he approached, until he could make out shapes, figures, standing in the darkness. His heart pounded harder in his chest as he stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. The figures were like shadows, their outlines barely discernible. But as they stepped into the light, Ethan saw them clearly. They were the others, Melissa, Tom, and Jasper, his friends. But they were different now. Their faces were pale, gaunt, hollow. Their eyes were wide and empty like hollow shells, their skin pulled tight against their bones. They looked as though they had been carved from stone, frozen in a state of limbo, caught between life and death. "They are here," the voice whispered, echoing in his mind. They are waiting. Ethan reached out a trembling hand toward Melissa, his fingers brushing her arm. She didn't respond. She didn't even seem to notice him. Her eyes were fixed forward, empty, unseeing. He turned to Tom, then to Jasper, but there was no recognition in their eyes either. They were lost, trapped in the same limbo that Jonah's heart had been in. They had become part of the cave, their souls bound to it, their names carved into the stone. And now, Ethan realized with growing horror, he had joined them. He was one of them now. You will never leave, the voice said, its tone thick with inevitability. Not now, not ever. A chill ran through Ethan as the truth settled in. The mountain had taken them all, one by one, each name carved into the walls, each soul imprisoned in the stone. And now, he was just another part of the endless cycle. He had come seeking shelter, but he had walked right into the heart of the beast. And now, there was no escape. But even as the weight of despair pressed down on him, a small, defiant spark of anger flickered in his chest. He wasn't ready to give up yet. He wouldn't let the cave claim him without a fight. Ethan stepped forward, his hands shaking as he reached for the nearest figure, Melissa's cold, lifeless hand. He didn't care if it was hopeless. He had to try. He had to break free. "Please," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Please, help me. We need to leave. We have to leave." But his words fell on deaf ears. Melissa didn't respond. Neither did Tom or Jasper. They stood there, frozen in place, their eyes empty, their souls long gone. Then, as Ethan's hand rested against Melissa's arm, something strange happened. A faint tremor ran through her body. Her eyes flickered, just for a moment, as if some part of her still recognized him. A brief flicker of light in the void. "Ethan." Her voice was barely a whisper, cracked and broken. It sounded as though it were coming from a great distance, like a dream fading away. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Melissa?" He shook her gently, but the tremor was already fading, the light in her eyes slipping away. "It's too late," she whispered. "There's no way out. We are already one." The shadows surged around them, thicker now, pulling at Ethan's limbs, dragging him toward the center of the cave. He tried to resist, but it was useless. The pull was too strong. The cave had already claimed him, and there was no fighting it. He could feel his body being pulled, his vision blurring as the dark tendrils wrapped around him, tightening their grip. "We are all one," the voice echoed again. "One in the stone, one in the darkness, forever." And with that final, damning whisper, Ethan's vision blurred, and the darkness closed in around him. The names would continue to be carved. New souls would be added to the record. The cycle would continue. The mountain would never stop, and Ethan would never leave. The mountain, the cave, everything had swallowed him whole. Time was lost in this place, an endless labyrinth of stone and shadow where nothing mattered but the whispers. The air was thick with the cold breath of the earth itself, pressing in from every corner, and the weight of the stone beneath his feet felt heavier than it ever had before. His limbs were stiff, his skin cold, yet the darkness within him burned like a fever. He was lost. They all were. "You belong here now," the voice echoed through the cave once more, its tone growing more insistent. The whispers had become a steady hum reverberating through his skull, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. "You are no longer you. You are part of the mountain, part of the stone, one of the forgotten." But Ethan refused to surrender. At least he thought he did. He struggled to remember a time when he wasn't a part of the cave, when his body wasn't tethered to the very walls that surrounded him. Was there a time when he had been free? Was there a life before the shadows took hold of him? His mind was fractured, memories slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. Faces, names, they were all fading, distorting into something unrecognizable, becoming part of the eternal cycle. The handprints on the walls, the voices in the dark, they were all a part of him now. He could feel their presence, their pain, mingling with his own, and it made him dizzy. But there was still a flicker of defiance in him, a final resistance to the fate that had been forced upon him. He wasn't ready to fade away completely. Not yet. You cannot fight it, the voice whispered, its cold fingers curling around his thoughts. The mountain claims you. The cycle repeats. There is no escape. Ethan's chest tightened, and he fought against the suffocating pressure. The shadows seemed to close in, their grasp tightening around his throat. He gasped for air, but it was as if the very cave had become his prison, its walls closing in on him. And then, as if a door had been opened in his mind, something shifted. A memory, long buried, surfaced. A name, Jonas Hart. The man who had been here before him. The one who had left his mark on the stone. His fate had been sealed, just as Ethan's was now. But Jonas had tried to warn him, hadn't he? There is no escape, Jonas had said. But what if that was a lie? What if there was a way out? If only he could find it. Ethan's eyes snapped open, his breath catching in his throat. He couldn't see through the darkness. The shadows around him had become thick like smoke, and it was impossible to tell where the cave ended and he began. But something in him stirred. A quiet voice, a pull deep within his chest. A part of him that had been lost, that had been buried beneath the weight of the mountain, was waking up. His hand reached out instinctively, as though drawn to something. His fingers brushed against the stone, and for a fleeting moment he thought he felt it. Something soft beneath his touch, like the faintest impression of warmth, of life. He pulled his hand back, startled, but there was no mistaking it. The stone was no longer cold. It was alive, breathing, pulsing beneath his skin. You can't fight it. We are one, the voice repeated louder now, as though it were mocking him. But this time, Ethan fought back. I'm not one of you, he muttered under his breath. I will not be a part of this. The shadows around him recoiled, their grip loosening for the briefest of moments. And in that instant, he felt it, the pull of something else. Not the mountain, not the stone, something different, something outside of it all. The walls seemed to shake, and the air around him grew, heavier still. But there was a strange sensation of space opening before him, a gap in the dark. It was fleeting, but it was there. The mountain was trying to pull him back, but he had seen it, felt it, the tiniest sliver of hope, a chance to escape. Ethan's heart raced. He moved forward, pushing against the weight of the shadows that threatened to drag him back. He forced himself to take a step, then another, and with each step the air grew thinner, the darkness less suffocating. You cannot leave. But Ethan didn't listen. The words, those whispers, that voice, were fading now, growing more distant. He was no longer listening to the cave, no longer listening to the shadows that had been woven into his soul. He stumbled through the darkness, his steps slow and unsteady, but he moved. His pulse thudded in his ears as the walls seemed to shift around him. They were no longer the prison they had once been. No longer the weight that had held him captive for what felt like an eternity. And then, through the dark, he saw it. A faint light, a sliver of warmth in the cold blackness. It was faint, but it was real. The cave was parting before him, the stone moving, shifting, as though the mountain itself were allowing him to leave. The shadows had pulled away. The whispers had receded. Ethan stepped toward the light. The moment he crossed the threshold, everything changed. It was no longer the cave, no longer the suffocating darkness. It was the sky. The storm had passed. The world was still. Ethan gasped for breath as he stepped out of the cave, his legs unsteady beneath him, his body shaking. The wind had calmed. The rain had stopped. The winter mountains stretched before him, vast and silent, their peaks shrouded in mist. The air was crisp, fresh, as though it had never been tainted by the darkness of the cave. He was free. Or was he? Ethan turned to look back at the cave, his heart sinking as the light faded from his eyes. There, just beyond the edge of the entrance, he could see them. The figures, his friends, they were standing in the mouth of the cave, their forms hazy, indistinct. They were still there, lost in the shadows, but they were no longer bound by the stone. Their eyes were wide, searching, but they didn't move. They were waiting for something, waiting for him. And as the mountain loomed silently behind him, Ethan realized with a sinking heart what the cave had taken from them. Not just their lives, not just their names, but their souls. He had escaped, but at what cost? The figures in the cave began to fade, dissolving into the mist as though they had never existed. "We are all one. You will never be free." The mountain's voice echoed in his mind one last time, but this time it was different. The words weren't mocking. They were hollow, distant, like an echo that had grown faint with time. And as Ethan took his first full breath of fresh air, he knew that the mountain would never truly let him go. The names, the souls, the whispers, they would always be a part of him. They would never fade. They would never truly leave, not for him, not for anyone who had entered the cave. And as he looked up at the sky, the mountain watching silently behind him, Ethan finally understood. Some places, some things, can never be escaped. They will always be waiting, always watching, always a part of you forever.